I'm 78 years old, and I'm standing on the same stretch of beach where my entire understanding of intelligence, consciousness, and humanity's place in the natural world was shattered 50 years ago. In my hands, I hold a weathered journal, its pages filled with observations that no peer-reviewed publication would ever accept, documentation of conversations that shouldn't be possible, and sketches of a creature that science insists doesn't exist. But here's what will truly disturb you, what kept me awake for 5 decades, what I'm finally ready to reveal now that I'm too old to care about my reputation. The Bigfoot I fed and studied for half a century wasn't hiding in the mountains. He was living along the coast, communicating with orcas in ways that suggest an intelligence older and perhaps wiser than our own. And what he eventually told me about why his species fears humans, about what they've observed in us over centuries of hiding in plain sight, is something that should terrify every person who hears it. Because, according to him, we're not the apex of evolution. We're the anomaly, the one species that consistently destroys the very systems that keep us alive. And his people have been watching us do it for generations, waiting to see if we'll finally understand before it's too late. Before we go any further, I need to ask something of you. If this story resonates with you, if what I'm about to share challenges something in your understanding of the world, take a moment to let me know. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already. I'm not doing this for fame or recognition. I'm 78. Those ships have sailed, but I need to know this message reaches people. I need to know that 50 years of keeping this secret, of protecting something precious, meant something. That's all I ask. Just let me know you're listening. My name is Dr. Marcus Brennan. I spent 43 years as a marine biologist, specializing in cetacean communication, specifically orca vocalizations in the Pacific Northwest. I published 67 peer-reviewed papers, mentored 32 graduate students, and received the MacArthur Fellowship in 1994 for my work on killer whale dialects. I'm telling you this not to brag, but to establish that I'm not some crackpot, not some attention seeker looking for my 15 minutes of fame. I'm a scientist. I was trained to observe, to document, to question, and to follow evidence wherever it leads. And the evidence led me somewhere impossible. It was October of 1973. I was 28 years old, fresh out of my doctoral program at the University of Washington, and absolutely convinced I was going to revolutionize our understanding of marine mammal communication. My dissertation had focused on the possibility that orcas possessed what could be classified as language, not just communication, but actual linguistic structures with grammar, syntax, and cultural transmission of knowledge. It was controversial work. Most of my committee thought I was anthropomorphizing, projecting human qualities onto animals that were simply responding to environmental stimuli. But I knew better. I'd spent 3 years listening to orcas, recording their calls, analyzing their patterns. They weren't just making noise. They were talking. They were teaching. They were telling stories. I'd secured a small research grant, barely enough to cover basic expenses, and permission to use an old lighthouse keeper station on Sentinel Island, a tiny piece of rock and forest about 12 miles off the coast of Washington State, just south of the Canadian border. The station had been automated in the 50s, and the keeper's house had sat empty for nearly 2 decades. It was perfect for my needs, isolated, positioned right along a major orca migration route and far enough from human activity that I could record vocalizations without interference from boat engines and coastal noise. The island was small, maybe 3 miles long and a mile wide at its widest point, covered in dense Sitka spruce and western hemlock, with rocky beaches that disappeared completely during high tide. The keeper's house was a sturdy structure built in the 1880s, 2 stories of weathered cedar, with a stone foundation and a widow's walk that gave me a 360-degree view of the surrounding waters. I moved in on October 1st, 1973. Everything I owned fit into a dozen boxes, recording equipment, reference books, clothes, and enough canned food to last 3 months. A fisherman named Dale Kowalski from Friday Harbor had agreed to bring me supplies once a month in exchange for $50 and whatever marine data I could share about fish populations. The isolation was exactly what I needed. No distractions, no department politics, no skeptical colleagues questioning my methods. Just me, the ocean, and the orcas. I established a routine quickly. Wake at dawn, check and calibrate the recording equipment, spend the morning analyzing previous day's recordings, afternoon observations from the beach or the widow's walk, evening documentation and notes. The orcas passed by the island regularly, usually in the late afternoon, 3 different pods that I'd begun to identify by their distinctive call patterns. By mid-October, I'd recorded over 40 hours of vocalizations and was beginning to identify what I believed were specific words or call units that appeared consistently in certain contexts. When the pods were hunting, they used a specific set of clicks and calls. When they were socializing, the vocalizations became more varied, more playful, and when they were traveling, they maintained almost constant communication, like a family on a road trip, checking in with each other, maintaining cohesion. It was fascinating work, but also lonely. I've been so focused on getting away from the university, from the skepticism and the politics, that I hadn't really considered what it would be like to spend months alone on a tiny island with no human contact. The silence at night was profound, almost oppressive. Just wind, waves, and the occasional call of an owl or the bark of a seal. October 15th, 1973. The night that changed everything. I'd spent the day tracking J-Pod, one of the resident orca families, as they moved south along the island's western shore. They'd been hunting. Their echolocation clicks sharp and frequent, and I'd gotten some excellent recordings. By the time the sun started setting around 6:30, I was exhausted but exhilarated. This was exactly the kind of data I needed. I decided to do one more recording session from the beach. The tide was going out, exposing the rocky shoreline, and I'd noticed that the orcas sometimes came closer to shore during low tide, possibly following salmon that used the shallower water. I hauled my equipment down the narrow trail from the keeper's house to the beach. A Nagra 4.2 reel-to-reel recorder, the best portable recording equipment available at the time, a directional microphone, headphones, and a waterproof hydrophone that I could lower into the water. The whole setup weighed about 40 pounds, and by the time I reached the beach, I was breathing hard. The evening was clear, unusual for October in the Pacific Northwest. The sky was that deep purple blue that happens just after sunset, with the first stars beginning to appear. The water was relatively calm, just a light chop, and I could hear the distant blows of orcas somewhere to the south. I set up my equipment on a flat section of rock about 20 feet from the waterline positioned the directional microphone toward the sound of the orcas, and lowered the hydrophone into a tidal pool deep enough to give me good underwater acoustics. Then I put on my headphones and started recording. The underwater world exploded into sound. The orcas were closer than I thought, maybe half a mile out, and they were vocal. I could hear at least 3 distinct voices, possibly more, engaged in what sounded like conversation. The calls overlapped, responded to each other, created patterns that my brain recognized as communicative even if I couldn't understand the content. I was so focused on the recordings, on adjusting levels and trying to identify individual voices, that I didn't notice I was being watched. It was a feeling that penetrated my concentration, that primal awareness that prey animals have when a predator is near. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My hand stopped moving on the recorder controls, and slowly, very slowly, I turned my head to look behind me. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark line of trees about 50 feet back from the beach, the massive trunks of Sitka spruce silhouetted against the last light in the sky. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw movement. Something large, much larger than a deer or a bear, standing just inside the tree line. My first thought, the rational explanation my scientific brain immediately grasped for, was that it was a person. Maybe Dale had come back to the island for some reason, or maybe there was a squatter, someone using the abandoned buildings on the southern end of the island. But even as I thought it, I knew it was wrong. The shape was wrong. Too tall, too broad. And it was standing completely still in a way that humans don't. That perfect predator stillness that speaks of patience and observation. I pulled off my headphones slowly, not wanting to make any sudden movements. The sound of the ocean rushed back, waves on rocks, wind in the trees, and underneath that, something else. A low, almost subsonic rumble that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. The shape moved just slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something that made my breath stop. Eyes, reflecting the last light from the sky, positioned at least 8 feet off the ground, watching me with an intensity that was unmistakably intelligent. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to grab my equipment and bolt back up the trail to the keeper's house. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, caught between terror and something else, something that felt almost like recognition. We stayed like that for what felt like hours but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. The creature, and my brain had finally accepted that's what it was, watching me from the trees. Me, standing on the beach with 40 pounds of recording equipment, completely exposed, completely vulnerable. Then the orcas called. A long, complex vocalization that my hydrophone picked up and transmitted through the headphones hanging around my neck. The sound was faint but clear in the quiet evening, and the creature responded. It was a vocalization unlike anything I'd ever heard. Low, resonant, complex. Not a roar, not a howl, but something structured, something that had the cadence of language, and it was directed not at me, but at the ocean, at the orcas. My scientific brain, even in the midst of fear and disbelief, recognized what I was hearing. The frequency range, the harmonic structure, the pattern of the call. It was similar to orca vocalizations. Not identical, but related, like 2 dialects of the same language family. The creature was communicating with the whales. The orcas responded. I heard it clearly through my headphones, a series of calls that had the same questioning tone I'd identified in their social vocalizations. They were answering. The creature made another sound, softer this time, and then, with a movement so fluid it seemed impossible for something so large, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I heard the sound of branches moving, footfalls that were surprisingly quiet, given the size of what I'd seen, and then nothing. I stood there on the beach, shaking, my mind racing to process what had just happened. Every piece of my scientific training was screaming that I'd misidentified something, that it had been a bear standing on its hind legs, that the vocalization had been some natural sound I'd misinterpreted, that the apparent communication with the orcas had been coincidence. But I knew better. I'd seen the eyes, the posture, the deliberate movement. I'd heard the vocalization and recognized its structure. And most importantly, I'd witnessed the response from the orcas, the clear back and forth that spoke of established communication, of relationship. Something impossible lived on this island, and it had a connection to the orcas that predated my presence, my research, possibly even human observation of these waters. I gathered my equipment with shaking hands, constantly looking over my shoulder at the tree line. The recording was still running, had been running through the entire encounter. Whatever had happened, I had it on tape. The hike back up to the keeper's house felt like it took forever. Every shadow seemed to hide something massive. Every sound made me jump. By the time I reached the house and locked the door behind me, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool October air. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk, headphones on, playing back the recording over and over, and there it was, clear as day. My breathing, the sound of the ocean, the orca vocalizations, and then that other sound, that impossible sound, the creature's call captured in perfect fidelity by my equipment. I ran it through every analysis I could think of. Spectrographic analysis showed a fundamental frequency around 60 hertz, well within the range of orca vocalizations. The harmonic structure was complex, showing multiple overtones and what appeared to be intentional modulation. The duration and pattern suggested deliberate communication, not random noise. And the orca's response, there was no question. They had answered. The timing, the change in their vocalization pattern, the specific calls they used, it all indicated they were responding to the creature's call. As dawn broke over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I sat back in my chair and faced the truth. I had evidence of something that shouldn't exist. A creature of enormous size, clearly intelligent, living in apparent communication with one of the ocean's most intelligent species. And I had absolutely no idea what to do about it. I spent the next 3 days in a state of near paralysis. I continued my routine, recording orcas, analyzing vocalizations, documenting observations, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time I went down to the beach, I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of the creature. Every sound in the forest made me jump. But there was nothing, no further sightings, no vocalizations, no evidence that anything unusual existed on the island at all. I began to doubt myself. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? The light had been poor. I'd been tired, focused on my work. Maybe it had been a bear. Maybe the vocalization had been some acoustic anomaly, sound bouncing off rocks in an unusual way. Maybe the orca's response had been coincidental. But then, on the morning of October 19th, I found something that erased all doubt. I'd gone down to the beach at low tide to check my hydrophone, which I'd left anchored in a deep tidal pool. The tide had gone out further than usual, exposing sections of beach I hadn't seen before. And there, in a patch of wet sand near the tree line, was a footprint. It was enormous, at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. 5 distinct toe impressions. The big toe offset like a human's, but much larger. The depth of the impression suggested something incredibly heavy, probably 700 or 800 pounds based on my rough calculations. I stood there staring at it, my heart pounding. This was real. This was physical evidence, not a misidentification, not an acoustic anomaly, but a footprint that couldn't belong to any known animal in the Pacific Northwest. I ran back to the house and grabbed my camera, a Nikon F2 that I used for documenting research sites. I took dozens of photographs from every angle, placed a ruler next to the print for scale, made detailed sketches in my field notebook. Then I mixed up some plaster of Paris and made a cast, something I'd learned to do in an undergraduate paleontology course. While the plaster was setting, I searched the area for more prints. I found 3 more, each one clear and distinct, showing the same basic structure. They formed a path from the tree line down to the water's edge, then back again. The stride length was incredible, nearly 6 feet between prints. Whatever had made these tracks had come down to the beach, possibly to the water itself, and then returned to the forest. And based on the freshness of the prints, the sharp edges not yet eroded by wind or water, it had happened recently. Possibly the previous night while I'd been in the house, obsessing over my recordings. The creature was still here, still watching. Still, for reasons I couldn't understand, interested in what I was doing. I carried the plaster cast back to the house with the reverence of someone handling a religious artifact. Because, in a way, that's what it was. Proof of something that existed outside the accepted boundaries of zoology. Something that would fundamentally challenge our understanding of North American megafauna. But as I sat at my desk, looking at the cast, at the photographs, at the spectrograms of the vocalization, I realized I faced an impossible choice. If I reported this, if I published my findings, I'd be laughed out of the scientific community. Bigfoot was a joke, a tabloid story, something that serious scientists didn't waste time on. My career would be over before it really began. But if I didn't report it, if I kept this secret, I'd be violating every principle of scientific inquiry I'd been trained to uphold. Scientists share data. We publish findings. We submit our work to peer review. Keeping evidence hidden was antithetical to everything I believed in. I decided to wait, to gather more data, more evidence, to build a case so strong that it couldn't be dismissed, and in the meantime, to continue my orca research as planned, maintaining the cover of normalcy while I investigated something impossible. It was a decision that would define the next 50 years of my life. That evening, I did something that felt absurd even as I was doing it. I took a fresh salmon, one that Dale had brought on his last supply run, and left it on the beach near where I'd found the footprints. I placed it on a flat rock, clearly visible, clearly intentional. Then I returned to the house and watched from the widow's walk as the sun set and darkness fell over the island. Around 9 o'clock, I saw movement on the beach, a large shape, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving with that same fluid grace I'd witnessed before. It approached the rock, paused, seemed to examine the salmon. Then, in a movement almost too quick to follow, it snatched the fish and retreated toward the tree line. But before it disappeared, it stopped, and it looked up toward the house, toward where I stood watching from the widow's walk. Even from that distance, even in the darkness, I could feel the weight of its gaze. Then it was gone, melted back into the forest as if it had never been there at all. The next morning, I found something on the same rock where I'd left the salmon, a perfect arrangement of shells, 5 of them, graduated in size from smallest to largest, placed in a spiral pattern. Next to them, a piece of sea glass worn smooth by decades of wave action, deep blue-green like the ocean itself. It was a gift, a response, an acknowledgement. The creature wasn't just intelligent, it understood reciprocity, the fundamental basis of social exchange. I give, you give. I offer, you offer. The foundation of relationship. I picked up the sea glass and held it up to the morning light. It glowed like a jewel, beautiful in its simplicity. And I understood that I'd been given something precious. Not just a piece of glass, but an invitation, a possibility. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, I could build a relationship with something that shouldn't exist. That I could learn from it, understand it, document something that no scientist had ever documented before. I just had to be patient. I had to earn trust, and I had to be willing to keep a secret that would challenge everything I thought I knew about intelligence, communication, and the hidden corners of the natural world. Over the next 2 weeks, I established a pattern. Every evening, I'd leave food on the beach, sometimes salmon, sometimes crab that I'd caught in pots, once a bag of apples that Dale had brought. And every morning, I'd find the food gone and something left in return. More shells, interesting stones, pieces of driftwood worn into strange shapes. Once a perfect sand dollar, unbroken and white as snow. We were communicating through gifts, through offerings. It was the oldest form of relationship building, older than language, older than culture, and it was working. I still hadn't seen the creature clearly, just glimpses, shadows, movements at the edge of perception. But I knew it was watching me. I could feel it observing my routines, learning my patterns, deciding whether I could be trusted. And then, on November 3rd, 1973, everything changed again. I was on the beach at low tide, recording orcas as usual. J-Pod was passing close to shore, and I was getting excellent vocalizations. I was so focused on my work that I didn't hear the creature approach. When I finally sensed its presence and turned around, it was standing less than 30 feet away, fully visible in the afternoon light. My first coherent thought was that it was even larger than I'd estimated, at least 8.5 feet tall, possibly 9, with shoulders that must have been 4 feet across. Its body was covered in dark reddish-brown hair, longer around the head and shoulders, shorter on the arms and torso. The face was a striking blend of human and ape. A broad, flat nose, a heavy brow ridge, lips that were more pronounced than a gorilla's but less than a human's. But it was the eyes that captured me. Dark, intelligent eyes that watched me with an expression I can only describe as curious assessment. Not the blank stare of an animal, but the focused attention of a thinking being trying to understand another thinking being. We stood there, frozen in mutual observation. My hands were still on my recording equipment, but I'd forgotten all about the orcas, about my research, about everything except the impossible creature standing before me. Then, slowly, deliberately, the creature raised one massive hand and pointed, not at me, but past me, toward the ocean, toward where the orcas were calling. It wanted me to understand something. It was trying to communicate. I turned slowly, following the direction of its gesture. The orcas were closer to shore than usual, maybe 200 yards out, and they were engaged in what appeared to be social behavior, breaching, spy-hopping, slapping their tails on the water's surface. When I turned back, the creature had moved closer, now only about 20 feet away. It pointed at the orcas again, then at its own ear, then at my recording equipment. The message was clear. It wanted to hear what I was hearing. It wanted to listen to the orcas through my equipment. My hands were shaking as I slowly removed my headphones. I held them out, an offering, an invitation. The creature watched me for a long moment, then took 3 steps forward. It was close enough now that I could see the texture of its hair, the way its chest rose and fell with each breath, the incredible detail of its hands, thick fingers with nails, not claws, palms, that showed calluses and wear. It reached out, moving with surprising delicacy, and took the headphones from my hand. Our fingers didn't touch, but they came close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from its skin. The creature examined the headphones, turning them over, studying the construction. Then, with a care that suggested understanding of fragile human technology, it placed them over its ears. The effect was immediate. Its eyes widened, its posture changed, its entire body seemed to focus on what it was hearing. The orca's vocalizations, amplified and clarified by my equipment, were reaching it in a way they never had before. And then the creature did something that made my scientific heart soar, and my understanding of the world crack open. It began to vocalize in response, matching the patterns it was hearing through the headphones, engaging in what was clearly conversation with the orcas. And the orcas answered. I could hear it through the headphones bleed, through the open air, through my hydrophone speaker. They were talking to each other, creature and whales, in a language that predated human observation, in a relationship that had existed long before I arrived on this island. I was witnessing something that no scientist had ever documented: interspecies communication between 2 of the most intelligent non-human species on Earth. And I was the bridge, the translator, the one providing the technology that allowed them to hear each other more clearly. The creature vocalized for perhaps 5 minutes, a complex series of calls and responses with the orcas. Then gently it removed the headphones and handed them back to me. Our fingers touched this time, just briefly, and I felt the warmth of its skin, the solid reality of its existence. It looked at me, and in its eyes I saw something that changed everything, not just intelligence, but gratitude, recognition, the beginning of trust. Then it did something I'll never forget. It placed one massive hand over its chest, over where its heart would be, and made a soft, low sound. Then it pointed at me and made the same gesture, hand over chest, the same sound. It was showing me something, teaching me, this is me, this is you. We are both here. We are both real. I mirrored the gesture, placing my hand over my own chest. Marcus, I said softly, saying my name. I'm Marcus. The creature tilted its head, processing. Then it made a sound, a vocalization that was clearly an attempt to reproduce what I'd said. It didn't sound like Marcus. The vocal anatomy was too different, but the intent was clear. It was trying to use my name. I pointed at it, questioning. The creature seemed to understand. It made a different sound, a specific vocalization that was clearly distinct from its other calls, a name, or at least an identifier. It sounded something like Natoon, with a resonance that my throat couldn't reproduce. But I tried, and the creature made that soft sound again, the one I was beginning to recognize as approval or pleasure. Neptune, I said, adapting the sound to something my human mouth could manage. I'll call you Neptune. The creature, Neptune, seemed to accept this. It made the approval sound again, then turned and walked toward the water's edge. It stopped at the tide line, looked back at me once, and then waded into the ocean. I watched in amazement as it moved through the water with the confidence of something completely at home in the marine environment. It dove under, disappeared for nearly a minute, then surfaced 30 feet out, holding something in its hands. It was a rockfish, caught with bare hands in a display of skill that would have impressed any fisherman. Neptune held it up, showing me, then made a specific vocalization toward the orcas, who were still nearby. One of the orcas, a large female I'd identified as J2, approached. Neptune tossed the fish toward her, and she caught it smoothly, then dove. When she surfaced, she was making a vocalization I'd recorded dozens of times. The call that orcas used when sharing food with pod members. Neptune had just shared food with an orca, had participated in their social structure, their culture, their family. I stood there on the beach, my recording equipment forgotten, watching as Neptune swam with the orcas for nearly 20 minutes. They moved together, dove together, surfaced together. It was clear this wasn't a new relationship. This was established, familiar, comfortable. Finally, Neptune returned to shore. It walked past me, water streaming from its hair, and paused at the tree line. It looked back, made that chest-touching gesture again, and then disappeared into the forest. I stood there as the sun began to set, trying to process what I'd witnessed. I'd just observed interspecies communication and cooperation at a level that challenged every assumption about intelligence, culture, and the boundaries between species. And I'd been accepted, at least provisionally, into that relationship. Neptune had shared something with me, had trusted me with knowledge that its species had apparently kept hidden from humans for generations. The question was, why? Why reveal itself to me? Why share this connection with the orcas? Why take the risk of exposure? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew I'd just been given the opportunity of a lifetime, the chance to study, to learn, to document something that would change our understanding of intelligence and communication. I just had to be worthy of that trust, and I had to be prepared for wherever this relationship would lead. Because standing there on that beach, watching the orcas swim away into the darkening ocean, I understood that this was just the beginning. Neptune had shown me a glimpse of something vast, something hidden, something that had existed alongside human civilization for centuries without our knowledge. And over the next 50 years, I would learn just how much we'd missed, how much we'd destroyed, and why Neptune's people had learned to fear us above all other threats in their world. But that night, I was simply grateful. Grateful for the gift of trust. Grateful for the opportunity to witness something impossible. And grateful that for reasons I didn't yet understand, I'd been chosen to bridge two worlds that had existed separately for far too long. The weeks following that first real contact with Neptune passed in a blur of observation, documentation, and growing wonder. November brought the typical Pacific Northwest weather, gray skies, constant drizzle, and winds that made the keeper's house creak and groan like a ship at sea. But the weather didn't stop Neptune from appearing, and it didn't stop me from meeting him on the beach nearly every day. We developed a routine that felt almost domestic in its regularity. I'd arrive at the beach around 3 in the afternoon when the tide was going out and the orcas typically passed by the island. I'd set up my recording equipment, and within 15 or 20 minutes, Neptune would emerge from the forest. Sometimes he'd watch from a distance first, observing, making sure I was alone. Other times, he'd approach immediately, comfortable enough now to come within 10 or 15 feet. The gifts continued. I'd bring food, salmon, crab, apples, once a jar of honey that Neptune examined with fascination before carefully opening and tasting. He'd bring me things from the forest and the shore, interesting stones, shells, pieces of driftwood, once a perfect eagle feather that must have taken him considerable time to find. But more than the physical gifts, we were exchanging something more valuable: attention, presence, the building blocks of relationship. By late November, I'd begun to understand the depth of Neptune's connection to the ocean. He wasn't just visiting the shore. He lived here in a way that was fundamentally different from inland creatures. His hands, which I'd had many opportunities to observe closely, showed adaptations I'd initially missed. The webbing between his fingers was more pronounced than I'd first noticed, extending nearly halfway up each digit. His feet, which I'd seen clearly when he waded into the water, were broad and flat, with a flexibility that suggested they could function almost like flippers. This wasn't just a Bigfoot who happened to live near the coast. This was a coastal subspecies adapted over generations to a marine environment. The implications were staggering. If Neptune's people had evolved specialized adaptations for coastal living, how many other regional variations might exist? How diverse was this hidden species? I documented everything in my journals, filling page after page with observations, sketches, and theories. But I told no one. Dale Kowalski came once a month with supplies, and each time he'd ask how the research was going, I'd talk about orcas, about vocalizations, about the excellent data I was collecting. I never mentioned the 9-foot creature I was meeting with, Daly, the one who was teaching me more about intelligence and communication than any university course ever had. The breakthrough in our communication came on December 7th, 1973. I remember the date because it was Pearl Harbor Day, and Dale had mentioned it when he dropped off supplies the day before, commenting on how the world had changed in the 32 years since the attack. I was on the beach with Neptune, and the orcas were particularly vocal that day. J-Pod and K-Pod had met up, two families coming together in what appeared to be a social gathering. The vocalizations were complex, overlapping, full of what I'd come to recognize as excitement and joy. Neptune was listening through my headphones, as he often did now, responding occasionally with his own calls. But this time, he did something different. He removed the headphones, handed them to me, and then began to draw in the wet sand. His drawings were crude but unmistakable. He drew a large shape, clearly meant to represent an orca. Then he drew a smaller shape next to it, another orca. Then several more, a family group. He pointed at the drawings, then at the ocean where the orcas were swimming, then made a specific vocalization. He was teaching me, showing me that the sound he'd just made corresponded to the concept of family or group or pod. My heart was racing. This was language instruction, deliberate teaching of vocabulary. I grabbed my own notebook and pen. I drew a simple stick figure of a human, then pointed at myself. Human, I said clearly. I am human. Neptune studied the drawing, then made a sound, a specific vocalization that was clearly his word for human. It sounded something like ha-man, close enough to our own word that I wondered if he'd learned it from listening to humans over the years. Then he drew his own figure in the sand, larger than my human stick figure, with the characteristic broad shoulders and sagittal crest. He pointed at himself and made another sound, Nekani, his word for his own people, their name for themselves. Nekani, I repeated, trying to match his pronunciation. Neptune made the approval sound, then touched his chest, the gesture we'd established. Yes, correct, understood. For the next 2 hours, we sat on that beach in the December cold, drawing in the sand and exchanging vocabulary. Neptune taught me his words for ocean, fish, whale, tree, sky, water. I taught him my words for the same concepts. We pointed, we drew, we vocalized, we built a bridge between our languages. Some concepts were easy, concrete nouns, things we could point at or draw. Others were harder. Neptune tried to teach me a word that seemed to mean something like the way the ocean sounds at night, a single vocalization that encompassed an entire sensory experience. I couldn't reproduce it properly, my vocal range was too limited, but I understood what he was trying to convey. Similarly, I tried to teach him the word friend, but realized I had no way to draw it. So instead, I drew 2 figures, one human, one nekane, standing close together. I drew a heart between them, then pointed at him and at myself. Neptune looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he reached out and placed his hand over the heart I'd drawn, covering it completely. He made a sound, soft and complex, that I couldn't begin to reproduce, but I understood the meaning. Yes, this thing between us, this connection. When the light began to fail and the temperature dropped, Neptune stood to leave, but before he went, he did something new. He knelt down in the sand and drew a series of symbols, not pictures, but abstract marks, lines, curves, dots, arranged in specific patterns. He pointed at the first symbol, then at the ocean. The second symbol, he pointed at the sky. The third, at himself. The fourth, at me. He was showing me a writing system. His people had written language. I stared at the symbols, my mind reeling. This wasn't just vocabulary exchange. This was evidence of a complex culture, one with symbolic representation, with the ability to record and transmit information across time and space. Neptune watched my reaction, and I could see something in his eyes. Not pride exactly, but a kind of satisfaction. He was showing me that his people weren't primitive, weren't simple forest creatures. They had language, culture, history. They were people in every sense that mattered. Before the symbols could be washed away by the incoming tide, I quickly sketched them in my notebook, copying each one as precisely as I could. Neptune watched, nodded approval, then stood and walked back toward the forest. That night, I sat in the keeper's house, staring at those symbols by lamplight. I'd just been given evidence that would revolutionize anthropology, linguistics, primatology, every field that touched on intelligence and culture, a non-human species with written language, with the ability to create abstract symbols and assign them meaning. But I couldn't share it. Not yet. Maybe not ever, because sharing it would mean revealing Neptune's existence. and I was beginning to understand that revelation would be dangerous for him, for his people, for whatever remained of their hidden culture. Over the following weeks, as December turned into January of 1974, Neptune taught me more of his language, both spoken and written. We'd meet on the beach, and he'd draw symbols in the sand, teaching me their meanings. Some represented concrete things: whale, tree, fish, stone. Others were more abstract: danger, safe, hidden, watching. That last word, watching, appeared frequently. Neptune would draw it, then gesture at the forest, at the ocean, at the sky. His people were always watching. It was how they'd survived. I began to understand the structure of his written language. It wasn't alphabetic like English, where symbols represented sounds. It was more logographic, like Chinese, where each symbol represented a complete concept or word. But there were also phonetic elements, ways to combine symbols to create new meanings or to represent sounds that didn't have their own symbols. The spoken language was even more complex. Neptune's vocal range was far broader than mine, extending into frequencies I could barely hear. He could produce sounds from deep subsonic rumbles that I felt in my chest to high, almost ultrasonic clicks. The language used this full range, creating a three-dimensional soundscape that my human throat could never fully reproduce. But he was patient with my limitations. He'd simplify his vocalizations, bringing them into my frequency range. He'd repeat things multiple times, showing me the mouth and throat positions. He was a natural teacher, and I was a motivated student. By February, we could have basic conversations. Not about complex philosophical concepts, my vocabulary was too limited for that, but about immediate, concrete things. I could tell him when I'd seen orcas, what they were doing, where they were going. He could tell me about weather coming, about tides, about the rhythms of the island. And slowly, carefully, he began to tell me about his people. It started with family. Neptune drew symbols in the sand, showing me the structure of his clan. There was him, Neptune. There was his mate. He drew a smaller figure with slightly different proportions, more graceful, with longer hair. There were others. He drew several more figures, but some of them he marked with a specific symbol that I'd learned meant gone or lost. His family had been larger once. Now it was smaller. The implication was clear and heartbreaking. I drew my own family structure, my parents, both still alive in Portland, my sister, married with 2 kids, me, alone on this island. Neptune studied my drawings, then pointed at me and made a questioning sound. Why alone? I tried to explain. I drew a building meant to represent the university. I drew many small figures inside, other people. Then I drew myself outside the building, separate. I pointed at the island, at the ocean, at the orcas. This is where I want to be. This is what I want to study. Neptune seemed to understand. He made a sound that I'd learned meant something like same or similar, then pointed at himself, at the forest, at the ocean. He was alone by choice, too, or at least separated from others of his kind. But there was more to it than that. Over the next several weeks, Neptune began to reveal the darker reasons for his isolation, for his people's hidden existence. It was late February 1974. The weather had been particularly harsh, with storms rolling in off the Pacific every few days, bringing heavy rain and winds that made it dangerous to be on the beach. I hadn't seen Neptune for nearly a week, the longest gap since we'd established our routine. When the weather finally cleared, I went down to the beach, hoping he'd appear. He did, but something was different. He was agitated, pacing, making sounds I'd never heard before, not aggressive, but distressed, anxious. I approached slowly, concerned. "Neptune? What's wrong?" He gestured urgently for me to follow him, then headed not toward the water, but inland into the forest. I hesitated. I'd never gone into the forest with him before. That was his territory, his private space. But his distress was obvious, so I followed. We walked for perhaps 20 minutes, moving deeper into the island's interior than I'd ever been. The forest here was old growth, massive Sitka spruce and western hemlock that had probably been standing for 300 or 400 years. The canopy was so thick that even in midday the light was dim and green. Finally, Neptune stopped in a small clearing, and there, hidden beneath a massive fallen log that had been carefully arranged with branches and moss, was a cache. Neptune moved the covering aside, revealing what was hidden beneath. My breath caught. There were artifacts, dozens of them, baskets woven from cedar bark, so finely made they could hold water, stone tools, not crude hand axes, but sophisticated implements, scrapers, knives, awls, each one carefully shaped and polished, wooden implements, some carved with intricate designs, and most startling of all, what appeared to be a form of fabric woven from some plant fiber I didn't recognize, dyed in subtle earth tones. This was material culture, evidence of technology, of craft, of artistic expression. Neptune's people weren't just intelligent, they had civilization, culture, traditions passed down through generations. But Neptune wasn't showing me these things with pride. His body language spoke of something else: sadness, loss, fear. He reached into the cache and pulled out something wrapped in the woven fabric. He unwrapped it carefully, reverently, and showed me what was inside. Photographs, old photographs, the kind printed on thick paper stock that hadn't been common since the 1940s or 50s, and newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, some of them so old the paper was brittle and crumbling. Neptune handed them to me, and I looked through them with growing horror. The photographs showed creatures like Neptune, Ne-Ka-Ne, but they were dead, laid out on the ground, surrounded by men with rifles, grinning for the camera like they'd just bagged a trophy buck. The men were dressed in clothing from various eras, some from the early 1900s, some from the 20s and 30s, some from as recently as the 50s. The newspaper clippings told similar stories. Headlines about wild man hunted in Oregon mountains and Sasquatch bounty offered in Washington Territory, and giant ape man killed by prospectors. The articles described hunting parties, rewards offered, creatures shot and killed, their bodies displayed before mysteriously disappearing, confiscated by authorities or lost in transit. This was genocide, systematic hunting of an intelligent species, treated as game animals, as monsters, as threats to be eliminated. I looked up at Neptune, tears in my eyes. I'm so sorry this happened." Neptune made a low, mournful sound. Then he began to draw in the dirt, showing me a story. He drew many figures, Ne-Ka-Ne, spread across a wide area. Then he drew human figures, small at first, then more and more of them, spreading, taking up space. The Ne-Ka-Ne figures began to disappear, one by one, until only a few remained, scattered, isolated, hiding. It was a history of displacement and destruction. As humans had spread across the Pacific Northwest, Neptune's people had been pushed back, hunted, killed, driven into the most remote corners of the wilderness. What had once been a thriving population was now reduced to scattered remnants, family groups hiding in the deep forests and remote coastlines, avoiding human contact at all costs. Neptune pointed at himself, then drew a small group of figures, his family, his clan. Then he drew human figures approaching, drew symbols that I'd learned meant danger and death. He pointed at some of the Neh-Ka-Ni figures and marked them with a symbol for gone. His family had been hunted. Some of them had been killed. He was showing me his trauma, his loss, the reason his people lived in constant fear. I sat down heavily on the forest floor, overwhelmed by what I was learning. "How many?" I asked, though I wasn't sure he'd understand the question. "How many of your people are left?" Neptune held up both hands, fingers spread. 10. Then he closed his hands and opened them again, showing fewer fingers. Then again, showing even fewer. He was showing me populations declining, generation after generation, hunted and displaced until almost nothing remained. There weren't many left. Maybe a few dozen, maybe less, scattered across the Pacific Northwest, living in constant hiding, teaching their children to fear humans above all other dangers. "Why did you reveal yourself to me?" I asked. "If humans are so dangerous, why take the risk?" Neptune looked at me for a long moment. Then he drew two figures in the dirt, one human, one Neh-Ka-Ni. He drew them standing apart, separated by a line. Then he erased the line and drew them standing together. He pointed at the orcas, whose calls we could hear faintly even this far inland, and made a gesture that encompassed the ocean, the forest, everything around us. I understood. He was saying that separation was the problem, that humans and Neh-Ka-Ni and orcas and all intelligent beings should be together, should be connected. The division, the hiding, the fear, it wasn't natural. It was a wound that needed healing. But then he drew something else. He drew human figures, many of them spreading across the land. He drew trees falling, drew the ocean becoming dark, drew animals disappearing. He was showing me destruction, environmental devastation, the impact of human expansion, and then he drew something that made my blood run cold. He drew the Neh-Ka-Ni figures disappearing, but not from hunting. They were fading away, becoming transparent, vanishing. He pointed at the destroyed forest, at the darkened ocean, and then at the fading Neh-Ka-Ni. His people weren't just being hunted to extinction. They were losing their habitat, their food sources, their entire way of life. As humans destroyed the old-growth forests, polluted the waters, drove away the salmon and the whales, the Neh-Ka-Ni were losing everything they needed to survive. Neptune was showing me that his people were dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, inevitably, as the world they'd lived in for thousands of years was transformed into something they couldn't survive in. And he was asking me, in the only way he could, if there was anything that could be done. If humans could change, if the destruction could be stopped. I had no answer for him. I was 28 years old, a junior researcher with no influence, no power, no ability to change the course of human civilization. What could I possibly do? But looking at Neptune, at the photographs of his people killed and displayed like trophies, at the evidence of a culture being systematically erased, I knew I had to try something. "I'll protect you," I said, knowing the words were inadequate. "I'll keep your secret. I'll watch over this island, make sure no one disturbs you here. And I'll try to understand, try to learn what you're teaching me. Maybe if I can document it, if I can show people that your kind exists, that you're intelligent, that you deserve protection, maybe things can change. Neptune looked at me with those dark, intelligent eyes. Then he reached out and placed his massive hand on my shoulder, gently, carefully. It was a gesture of trust, of hope, of desperate faith that maybe, just maybe, one human could be different. We stayed in that clearing for another hour. Neptune showed me more of the artifacts, explained through drawings and gestures what they were used for, how they were made. He was sharing his culture with me, trusting me with knowledge that his people had kept hidden for generations. When we finally returned to the beach, the sun was setting, painting the ocean in shades of orange and gold. The orcas were passing by, their calls clear in the evening air. Neptune stood at the water's edge listening, and I stood beside him. He made a vocalization, complex and beautiful, and the orcas responded. They were talking about the day, about food, about family, about the simple, profound business of living. And for a moment, standing there between the forest and the ocean, between the hidden world of the Nekahne and the visible world of humans, I felt like I understood something fundamental. Intelligence wasn't unique to humans. Culture wasn't unique to humans. The capacity for love, for grief, for hope, for connection, none of it was uniquely human. We shared this world with other minds, other peoples, other ways of being. And our failure to recognize that, our insistence on seeing ourselves as separate and superior, was destroying not just other species, but ourselves. Neptune turned to me and made the chest-touching gesture, the one that meant, I am here, you are here, we are both real. I mirrored it, placing my hand over my heart. I see you, I said, using the English words, but trying to convey the deeper meaning. I recognize you. I acknowledge your existence, your intelligence, your right to be here. Neptune made a sound, soft and warm, that I'd come to recognize as his version of gratitude or affection. Then he walked back toward the forest, pausing at the tree line to look back once before disappearing into the shadows. I stood on the beach as darkness fell, listening to the orcas, feeling the weight of what I'd learned. Neptune had trusted me with his people's history, their tragedy, their desperate situation. And in doing so, he'd given me a responsibility I wasn't sure I could bear. But I would try. For the next 50 years, I would try. The spring of 1974 brought changes to the island. The weather improved, the days grew longer, and life exploded in the forests and waters around Sentinel Island. Salmon began their runs. Seabirds returned to nest on the rocky cliffs, and the orcas passed by more frequently, following the abundant food. Neptune's visits became more frequent too and more complex. He began bringing his mate, the female I'd seen only briefly in my first weeks on the island. She was smaller than Neptune, perhaps 7.5 feet tall, with reddish-brown fur that had a golden sheen in the sunlight. She was more cautious than Neptune, always keeping her distance, always watching me with wary eyes. Neptune introduced her through drawings in the sand. He drew 2 figures, one large, one smaller, and made specific vocalizations for each. Then he pointed at himself and made his name sound Nehtun, and pointed at her and made a different sound, something like Marina. Marina, I said, adapting it to English. Neptune made the approval sound. Marina watched this exchange with what I can only describe as skeptical interest. She clearly understood that Neptune and I had developed some form of communication, but she wasn't sure what to make of it or of me. Over the following weeks, Marina slowly became more comfortable with my presence. She'd approach closer, though never as close as Neptune. She'd accept food offerings, though she'd always let Neptune take it first, testing for safety. And gradually, she began to participate in our communication sessions. I learned that Marina had a different perspective than Neptune. Where he was curious about humans, willing to take risks to build connection, she was more pragmatic, more focused on survival. Through drawings and gestures, she made it clear that she thought Neptune's openness with me was dangerous, that trusting any human was a risk their people couldn't afford. But she also seemed to understand why Neptune was doing it. One day in late April, she drew a series of symbols in the sand that Neptune had taught me. She drew the symbol for Nekani, then the symbol for few or small number, then the symbol for ending or gone. Her people were disappearing, and she knew it. Then she drew the symbol for human, and the symbol for many, and the symbol for everywhere. Humans were spreading, taking over every space, leaving no room for anyone else. Finally, she drew a symbol I hadn't seen before. It was complex, combining elements of several other symbols. Neptune saw it and made a sound low and sad. He translated for me, drawing simpler symbols that I understood. The complex symbol meant something like, "The world is changing," or "The old ways are ending." Marina was saying that their traditional strategy of hiding, of avoiding all human contact, wasn't working anymore. There was nowhere left to hide. The world was changing too fast, and her people couldn't adapt quickly enough. Something different had to be tried, even if it was dangerous. That's why she was here, why she was allowing herself to be seen by me. Not because she trusted me, but because the alternative, continuing to hide until there was nowhere left to hide, was worse. It was a sobering realization. I wasn't just being given a gift of trust. I was being given a responsibility born of desperation. Neptune and Marina were taking a calculated risk, hoping that one human, properly educated, properly connected to their world, might somehow make a difference. In May of 1974, Marina brought me to see something that changed my understanding of the Nekahne's relationship with the ocean. It was early morning, just after dawn, and I was on the beach doing my usual orca recordings. Neptune and Marina appeared together, which had become more common. But instead of our usual routine, Marina gestured urgently for me to follow her. We walked along the beach to the northern end of the island, where a series of tide pools formed a complex maze of interconnected basins. Marina led me to the largest pool, perhaps 20 feet across and 6 feet deep at its center. And there, in the pool, was a young Nekahne. My heart nearly stopped. It was a child, probably equivalent to a human 4- or 5-year-old, with lighter fur than either parent, almost golden brown. It was playing in the tide pool, diving under the water, surfacing with shells and small crabs, examining them with intense curiosity. Neptune and Marina had a child, and they were showing it to me. The young one noticed me and immediately swam to Marina's side, clinging to her leg, watching me with wide, fearful eyes. Marina made soft, reassuring sounds, and Neptune approached me, making gestures that I understood meant slow, careful, no danger. I sat down on a rock about 15 feet from the tide pool, milking myself, small, non-threatening. I didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. After several minutes, The young one's curiosity overcame its fear. It peeked out from behind Marina, watching me. I smiled but didn't move. The child looked up at Neptune, who made an encouraging sound. Slowly, the young one moved away from Marina, wading through the shallow water toward where I sat. It stopped about 10 feet away, studying me with the same intense focus I'd seen in Neptune's eyes during our first encounter. Then it did something that made my heart melt. It picked up a small shell from the tide pool and held it out toward me, arm extended, offering a gift. I slowly reached out and accepted the shell, holding it carefully. "Thank you," I said softly. "It's beautiful." The child made a sound, high-pitched and musical, clearly pleased. Then it scampered back to Marina, who wrapped a long arm around it protectively. Neptune drew in the wet sand, showing me the family structure. Him, Marina, and the child, whose name sound was something like Ka-Li. Their daughter, born the previous summer, now almost a year old. I was witnessing something that no human had probably ever seen. A Nekane family, 3 generations living together, raising their young, teaching them the skills they'd need to survive in a world that was increasingly hostile to their existence. Over the following months, I watched Ka-Li grow and learn. Neptune and Marina were attentive parents, teaching her constantly. They showed her which plants were safe to eat, how to catch fish in the tide pools, how to read the weather by watching the clouds and feeling the wind. They taught her to be silent, to move through the forest without sound, to hide at the first sign of danger. But they also taught her about the ocean, and this was where I saw something truly remarkable. Neptune would take Ka-Li into the water, holding her as they swam together. He'd dive under, showing her how to hold her breath, how to move efficiently through the water. Marina would demonstrate how to pry shellfish from rocks, how to find the best feeding spots at low tide, and most amazingly, they taught her to communicate with the orcas. I witnessed this one afternoon in June. J-Pod was passing by, and Neptune waded into the water with Ka-Li. He made a specific vocalization, and the orcas responded, approaching closer to shore than usual. One of the younger orcas, probably around Ka-Li's age in orca years, swam right up to where Neptune stood in chest-deep water. Neptune made encouraging sounds to Ka-Li, who was clinging to his shoulders, clearly nervous. Then, with gentle guidance from Neptune, Ka-Li reached out and touched the young orca. The orca didn't flinch, didn't swim away. Instead, it rolled slightly, allowing Ka-Li to run her small hand along its side. Ka-Li made a sound, wonder, and delight mixed together. The young orca responded with its own vocalization, and suddenly they were communicating, child to child, across species boundaries that humans insisted were absolute. I watched through tears as Ka-Li and the young orca played together in the shallow water, Neptune standing guard, the adult orcas watching from deeper water. It was a scene of such pure joy, such innocent connection, that it broke something open in my chest. This was what the world could be. Different species, different forms of intelligence, connecting, playing, learning from each other. Not competition, not dominance, not exploitation, but cooperation, relationship, mutual enrichment. And humans were destroying it. Through our hunting, our pollution, our relentless expansion, we were eliminating the possibility of these connections. We were making the world smaller, simpler, lonelier. That evening, after Neptune and his family had returned to the forest, I sat in the keeper's house and wrote in my journal, trying to capture what I'd witnessed. But words felt inadequate. How could I describe the look in Kali's eyes when she touched the orca? How could I convey the sound of her laughter so similar to a human child's as she played in the water? I was documenting something precious, something that might not exist much longer. And I had no idea how to protect it, how to ensure that Kali would grow up in a world where she could swim with orcas, where her people could live without fear, where intelligence and consciousness in all its forms could flourish. All I could do was bear witness, document, observe, learn, and hope that somehow, someday, this knowledge would matter. The summer of 1974 passed in a rhythm of observation and learning. My official research on orca vocalizations was going well. I was collecting excellent data, making discoveries about dialect variation and cultural transmission that would eventually form the basis of several published papers. But my real education was happening on the beach with Neptune, Marina, and Kali. They taught me to see the ocean differently, not as a resource to be exploited, but as a living community, a network of relationships and dependencies that had evolved over millions of years. The orcas weren't just animals making noise, they were people with cultures, languages, families, histories. The salmon weren't just fish. They were the foundation of an entire ecosystem, connecting ocean to forest, feeding bears and eagles and nekane and orcas in an intricate web of interdependence. And the nekane weren't primitive creatures hiding in the woods. They were a people with their own culture, their own knowledge systems, their own ways of understanding and relating to the world. In many ways, their understanding was more sophisticated than mine, more holistic, more attuned to the complex relationships that sustained life. Neptune showed me this one day in late July. We were sitting on the beach, and he drew an elaborate diagram in the sand. It showed the ocean, the forest, the sky, all connected by flowing lines. He drew salmon swimming from ocean to rivers, dying in the streams, their bodies feeding the forest. He drew trees growing, falling, washing into the ocean, providing habitat for fish and invertebrates. He drew orcas hunting, their waste fertilizing the water, supporting the plankton that fed the fish, that fed the salmon, that fed the orcas. It was an ecological diagram showing nutrient cycles, energy flows, the interconnection of all things, and Neptune had drawn it from memory, from knowledge passed down through his culture, knowledge that Western science was only beginning to understand. "You've known this all along," I said, gesturing at the diagram. "Your people have understood these connections for generations." Neptune made the affirmative sound, then drew something else. He drew human figures and showed them taken from the system, cutting trees, catching fish, but not giving back. The lines of connection began to break, the cycles interrupted. He was showing me that humans had removed themselves from the web of reciprocity. We took but didn't give back. We consumed but didn't contribute. We'd made ourselves separate from the natural cycles that sustained everything else. And that separation was killing the world. Not quickly, not obviously, but steadily, inevitably, as we broke connection after connection, interrupted cycle after cycle, simplified the complex web of life into something that couldn't sustain itself. "How do we fix it?" I asked, though I knew Neptune probably couldn't answer such a complex question with our limited shared vocabulary. But he tried. He drew the human figures again, but this time he drew them connected to the web, participating in the cycles. He drew them giving as well as taking, contributing as well as consuming. He drew the lines of connection restored, the cycles flowing again. Then he pointed at me, at himself, at the ocean where the orcas were calling. He was saying that the fix started with connection, with relationship, with recognizing that we were part of the web, not separate from it. It was a simple message, but profound. And it was one that I would spend the next 50 years trying to understand and communicate. As summer turned to fall, I began to notice changes in Neptune and Marina's behavior. They were more cautious, more vigilant, spending more time watching the horizon, listening to sounds I couldn't hear. Something had them worried. In late September, I found out what it was. I was on the beach when Neptune appeared, more agitated than I'd ever seen him. He gestured urgently for me to follow, and we actually ran through the forest to the northern end of the island. There, pulled up on a small beach I hadn't known existed, was a boat. Not Dale's fishing boat, which I would have recognized, but a larger vessel, maybe 30 feet long, with fishing gear and what looked like camping equipment. Someone else was on the island, and Neptune's family was in danger. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at the unfamiliar boat pulled up on the hidden beach. It was a commercial fishing vessel, older, with rust stains bleeding down the white hull and nets piled haphazardly on the deck. But what made my blood run cold were the rifles I could see mounted in a rack inside the cabin, visible through the salt-stained windows. Neptune stood beside me, every muscle in his massive body tense, radiating a fear I'd never felt from him before. He made a low sound, barely audible, that I'd learned meant danger, immediate threat, the kind of warning his people probably used when predators were near. "How many?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure he'd understand the question in this context. Neptune held up 3 fingers, 3 humans, somewhere on his island, in his territory, near his family. I looked back at the boat, trying to think. This was my island, too, technically. I had permission to be here for my research. These people, whoever they were trespassing. I had every right to confront them, to order them to leave, but the rifles complicated things. And the fact that they'd landed on the most remote, hidden beach on the island suggested they weren't here by accident. They were here deliberately, trying to avoid being seen. "Stay hidden," I said to Neptune, making the gesture we'd developed for concealment, for staying out of sight. "Keep Marina and Kali safe. I'll find out what they want." Neptune made a sound of protest, but I shook my head firmly. "I'm human. They won't hurt me. But if they see you—" I didn't finish the sentence. We both knew what would happen if hunters found a Bigfoot. I made my way back through the forest toward the keeper's house, moving as quickly as I could while trying to stay quiet. My mind was racing. Who were these people? What were they doing here? And most importantly, had they seen any sign of Neptune's family? As I approached the clearing where the keeper's house stood, I heard voices, male voices, rough and loud, the kind of voices that belonged to men who weren't worried about being overheard. I stepped out of the tree line and saw them, 3 men, probably in their 40s or 50s, dressed in hunting clothes, standing near my equipment shed. One of them was trying the door, which I always kept locked. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady and authoritative. They spun around, and I saw surprise flash across their faces. They hadn't expected anyone to be here. "Well, hell," the tallest one said, recovering quickly. He had a weathered face, gray stubble, and eyes that assessed me with the calculating look of someone used to sizing up potential threats. Didn't know this island was occupied. It is, I said firmly. I'm Dr. Marcus Brennan. I have a research permit from the National Park Service to conduct marine biology studies here. This is a restricted area. The tall man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Research, huh? What kind of research? Cetacean vocalizations, whale communication. I gestured toward the beach where my recording equipment was visible. I'm studying orca dialects. Orcas, one of the other men said, shorter, stockier, with a red face that suggested he spent a lot of time outdoors. That's all you're studying? Nothing else unusual on this island? My stomach dropped, but I kept my expression neutral. Like what? The tall man pulled something from his jacket pocket. A photograph, old and faded, but clear enough. It showed a creature that looked remarkably like Neptune, standing in a forest clearing, partially obscured by shadows. The photo was grainy, probably taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Like this, the tall man said, watching my reaction carefully. We've been tracking reports of these things for 20 years. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call them. And we've got reliable information that there's one living on this island. I forced myself to laugh, though it sounded hollow even to my ears. Bigfoot? You're serious? Look, I've been living here for over a year, and I've seen bears, deer, seals, eagles, but no Bigfoot. Those things don't exist. That's what everyone says. The third man spoke up for the first time. He was younger than the others, maybe early 30s, with intense eyes and a way of standing that suggested military training. Right up until we prove otherwise. We've got evidence, tracks, vocalizations, eyewitness accounts, and they all point here. Then your evidence is wrong, I said flatly. There's nothing like that on this island, and even if there was, you're trespassing on a restricted research site. You need to leave. The tall man's smile faded. We've got permission to be here. Hunting permit, issued by the state. We're tracking a dangerous animal that's been reported in this area. Hunting permit for what? There's no hunting season for imaginary creatures. For bear, the stocky man said. We're hunting bear. If we happen to find something else, well, that's just a bonus. They were lying, and we both knew it. But they had paperwork, probably legitimate enough to pass casual inspection, and I had no authority to physically remove them from the island. How long are you planning to stay? I asked, trying a different approach. As long as it takes, the tall man said. Could be a few days, could be a couple weeks. We'll stay out of your way, do our hunting, and leave when we're done. You won't even know we're here. That was exactly what I was afraid of. If they were here for weeks, constantly moving through the forest, there was no way Neptune and his family could avoid being seen. And if these men were serious Bigfoot hunters, they'd know what signs to look for. Tracks, broken branches, the subtle evidence of something large moving through the forest. I need to ask you to stay away from the northern end of the island, I said, thinking quickly. That's where I have sensitive recording equipment set up. If you disturb the area, you'll ruin months of research data. The tall man studied me for a long moment. The northern end. That's interesting. That's exactly where we picked up the strongest signs. My blood ran cold. They'd already found evidence. Probably the same tracks and signs that I'd been carefully documenting for months. Those are bear signs, I said firmly. There's a large black bear that frequents that area. I've seen it multiple times. Big bear, the younger man said. Must be, 8 feet tall when it stands up, walks on 2 legs, leaves footprints with 5 toes and no claw marks? They knew. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they'd already found signs of it. I had to warn Neptune, had to get these men away from the northern end of the island, away from where his family was hiding. "Look," I said, changing tactics, "I don't know what you think you're going to find here, but I can tell you that you're wasting your time. I've been here for over a year, and I've documented every species on this island. There's nothing unusual, nothing that doesn't belong in a standard Pacific Northwest ecosystem." "Then you won't mind if we look around," the tall man said. It wasn't a question. "Actually, I do mind. This is a research site, and your presence is disruptive. I'm going to have to contact the Park Service and report this trespass." The tall man's expression hardened. "You do that, Dr. Brennan, and while you're at it, maybe explain to them why you've been so secretive about your research, why you haven't published any findings, why you've been living alone on this island for over a year with minimal outside contact. Makes a person wonder what you're really doing out here." It was a threat, thinly veiled. They were suggesting that I was the one doing something wrong, that my presence here was suspicious. "My research timeline is my own business," I said coldly, "and I don't answer to you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." I turned and walked toward the keeper's house, feeling their eyes on my back. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Through the window, I watched them confer quietly, then head back toward the beach where their boat was hidden. They weren't leaving. They were just regrouping, planning their next move. I had to find Neptune, had to warn him that these men were serious, that they had evidence, that his family was in immediate danger. I waited until the men disappeared into the forest, heading south toward their boat. Then I grabbed my pack, threw in some supplies, and headed north, moving as quickly as I could while staying quiet. I found Neptune at the tide pools where Kali liked to play. Marina was there too, holding their daughter close, her eyes wide with fear. They'd sensed the danger, probably heard the men moving through the forest, and had retreated to this relatively open area where they could see threats approaching. "They're hunters," I said without preamble, using the combination of words and gestures we'd developed. "They're looking for you. They have evidence, tracks, photographs. They know you're here." Neptune made a low, anguished sound. Marina pulled Kali closer, and the child, sensing her parents' fear, began to whimper. "You'll have to leave the island," I said. "It's not safe anymore. They have rifles. They have permission to be here, and they're not going to stop until they find you." Neptune shook his head violently. He drew quickly in the sand, showing me the island, then drawing lines extending out into the ocean. He was showing me that there was nowhere to go. The nearest land was 12 miles away, too far to swim, especially with a young child, and even if they could reach the mainland, where would they go? Every forest, every coastline was increasingly occupied by humans. "Then hide," I said desperately. "Stay out of sight. Don't make any sounds. Don't leave any tracks. I'll try to get them to leave, but you have to be invisible." Marina made a sound, sharp and bitter. She drew in the sand, showing human figures spreading across the land, showing Neka-Ni figures disappearing. She was saying what I already knew, that hiding wasn't a solution anymore. There was nowhere left to hide. Neptune placed his hand on Marina's shoulder, calming her. Then he looked at me with those dark, intelligent eyes, and I saw something there that broke my heart. Resignation. Acceptance. The look of someone who'd been running their entire life and was tired of running. He drew something new in the sand. He drew himself, standing in the open. He drew human figures approaching. And then he drew a symbol I'd seen before, in the cache of artifacts he'd shown me months ago. It was the symbol that meant truth or revelation or the end of hiding. No, I said, understanding what he was suggesting. No, Neptune, you can't. If you reveal yourself to them, they'll kill you or capture you. Either way, you'll never be free again. But Neptune shook his head. He drew more symbols, creating a complex message that took me several minutes to decipher. He was saying that the hiding was already over, that these men would find evidence no matter how careful his family was, that the only choice was between being discovered on their terms or on his terms. And he was saying something else, something that made my throat tight with emotion. He was saying that he trusted me, that if he had to be revealed to humans, he wanted it to be with me present, with someone who understood, who could bear witness, who might be able to protect his family even if he couldn't protect himself. There has to be another way, I said, but even as I spoke, I knew he was right. The hunters weren't going to leave. They'd search every inch of this island until they found what they were looking for. And when they did, it would be on their terms, probably with rifles raised, probably with violence. Marina made a sound, questioning, looking between Neptune and me. Neptune drew more symbols, explaining his plan to her. Her reaction was immediate and fierce. She made sounds of protest, gestured angrily, drew symbols that clearly meant danger and death and no. But Neptune was calm, patient. He drew more symbols, showing her that they had no good choices, only less bad ones. He showed her that I was different from other humans, that I'd kept their secret for over a year, that I'd learned their language, that I'd been trusted with their culture. Finally, Marina's protests faded. She looked at me with eyes full of fear and desperate hope. Then she drew a single symbol in the sand, the one that meant promise or oath. She was asking me to promise that I'd protect them, no matter what happened. I promise, I said, placing my hand over my heart in the gesture they'd taught me. I'll do everything I can to keep you safe. Marina held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She didn't trust me, not completely, but she understood that I was the best chance they had. Neptune drew one more thing in the sand, a plan. He showed the hunters searching the southern part of the island. He showed himself revealing his presence there, drawing them away from where Marina and Carly would be hiding. He showed me staying with his family, protecting them while he dealt with the hunters. You're going to sacrifice yourself, I said, horror washing over me. You're going to let them find you so your family can stay hidden. Neptune made the affirmative sound, then touched his chest, then pointed at Marina and Carly. His family was more important than his own safety. He would draw the danger to himself to protect them. No, I said firmly, we're not doing it that way. If you're going to reveal yourself, we do it together. We control the situation. We make sure they understand what you are, that you're intelligent, that you're not just an animal to be shot. Neptune looked at me, surprised. I drew my own plan in the sand. I showed myself approaching the hunters, telling them I'd found evidence of something unusual. I showed them following me to a specific location, a clearing near the southern beach, where we could control the encounter. I showed Neptune appearing, but with me present, with me as intermediary, as translator, as witness. We make them see you as a person, I said, not a monster, not a trophy, but a thinking, feeling being who deserves respect. It's risky, but it's better than letting them hunt you down. Marina made a sound, questioning. Neptune translated through drawings. She was asking if humans could see them as people, if humans were capable of that kind of recognition. I thought about the photographs Neptune had shown me. The dead Nerka displayed like hunting trophies. The newspaper clippings about bounties and hunting parties. I thought about humanity's history of violence toward anything we perceived as other, as different, as threatening. I don't know, I admitted. Some humans can. Some humans will see your intelligence, your culture, your right to exist. But others... I didn't finish the sentence. Neptune drew another symbol, one I'd seen before. It meant risk, or danger, or the moment when everything changes. He was saying that this was that moment, that they'd reached the point where hiding was no longer possible, where they had to take the risk of being seen, of being known, and hope that humanity had evolved enough to respond with recognition rather than violence. It was a terrible gamble. But looking at Marina holding Kali, at Neptune standing tall despite his fear, I understood that they'd already made their choice. They were going to step out of the shadows, and I was going to be there to witness it. Okay, I said. We do this tomorrow morning. I'll bring the hunters to the southern clearing at dawn. Neptune, you'll be there, but at a distance at first. We'll let them see you gradually, let them understand what they're seeing before they can react with violence. Marina, you and Kali stay hidden in the northern caves. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Understood? Marina made a sound of protest, but Neptune touched her face gently, making soft vocalizations that were clearly reassurance, clearly love. Then he drew one final symbol in the sand, the complex one that meant the world is changing. Everything was about to change, for Neptune's family, for me, for the hunters, for everyone. And I had no idea if we'd survive it. That night, I barely slept. I lay in my bed in the keeper's house, listening to the wind and the waves, thinking about what we were about to do. I was going to reveal the existence of a species that science insisted didn't exist. I was going to put Neptune in direct contact with humans who'd been hunting his kind for decades. I was gambling everything, his life, his family's safety, my career, my credibility, on the hope that these men would see what I saw when I looked at Neptune, not a monster, not an animal, but a person. Just before dawn, I got up and made my way through the dark forest to where the hunters had set up camp near their boat. I could see the glow of their campfire, hear their voices as they planned their day's search. I stepped into the firelight, and all three men jumped up, hands moving toward weapons. Easy, I said, raising my hands. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I found something you're looking for. The tall man, whose name I'd learned was Garrett, studied me suspiciously. What did you find? Tracks, I said. Fresh ones, large bipedal, definitely not bear. They lead to a clearing about half a mile south of here. Whatever made them is probably still in the area. Garrett's eyes lit up with predatory excitement. Show us. There are conditions, I said firmly. You don't shoot unless it attacks. You let me approach first. And you document everything, photographs, recordings, evidence. If this is what you think it is, the scientific value is more important than a trophy. We're not trophy hunters, the younger man, whose name was Kyle, said defensively. "We're researchers. We want proof, not pelts." "Then we understand each other," I said, though I didn't believe him for a second. I'd seen the rifles, seen the way they talked about hunting. But if I could control the situation, keep them from shooting first and asking questions later, maybe we had a chance. We set out as the sky began to lighten, moving through the forest in single file. I led them south, toward the clearing where Neptune and I had agreed to meet. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. As we approached the clearing, I held up my hand, signaling them to stop. "Wait here," I whispered. "Let me check the area first. If it's there, I don't want to spook it." Garrett looked like he wanted to argue, but finally nodded. "5 minutes. Then we're coming in whether you're ready or not." I moved forward alone, stepping into the clearing as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. And there, on the far side, partially hidden in shadow, was Neptune. He looked magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Standing at his full height, easily 8.5 feet tall, shoulders broad enough to dwarf any human, covered in dark reddish-brown fur that caught the morning light. His face was calm, composed, but I could see the tension in his body, the fear he was controlling through sheer will. I turned back toward where the hunters waited. "He's here," I called out. "But you need to approach slowly. No sudden movements, no weapons raised. He's not aggressive, but he will defend himself if threatened." The 3 men emerged from the trees, and I heard their collective intake of breath as they saw Neptune. Garrett's hand moved toward his rifle, but I stepped between them. "Don't," I said sharply. "Look at him. Really look. He's not attacking. He's not threatening. He's just standing there watching us. That's not animal behavior. That's intelligence." "Jesus Christ," Kyle whispered. "It's real. It's actually real." Neptune made a sound, low and resonant, and I recognized it as the greeting vocalization he used with me. He was trying to communicate, trying to show them he was more than just a creature to be feared. "He's talking," I said. "That sound has meaning. He's trying to communicate with you." "Bullshit," Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Animals make sounds. Doesn't mean it's language." "Then watch this," I said. I turned to Neptune and made a series of gestures we'd developed, asking him to demonstrate his intelligence. Neptune responded immediately, moving to a patch of clear ground and beginning to draw symbols in the dirt with a stick. The hunters moved closer, fascinated despite their skepticism. Neptune drew the symbol for human, then the symbol for nekani, then the symbol for different, but same. He was showing them that we were separate species, but equally intelligent, equally deserving of recognition. "He's writing," Kyle said, his voice filled with awe. "That's a writing system. Those are symbols with meaning." Neptune continued, drawing more complex arrangements. He drew the ocean, drew orcas, drew himself, communicating with them. He was showing them his relationship with the whales, his connection to the marine ecosystem. Garrett had lowered his rifle, staring at the symbols with an expression I couldn't quite read. "How long have you known about this?" he asked me. "Over a year," I admitted. "I've been studying him, learning his language, documenting his culture. He's not alone. There are others, a family group. They've been living on this island for generations, hiding from humans because humans have been hunting them to extinction." "Hunting them?" the stocky man, whose name was Pete, said. "We're not hunters. We're trying to prove they exist, to get them scientific recognition, protection. By tracking them with rifles? I shot back. By sneaking onto their territory without permission. You say you want to protect them, but everything about your approach says you see them as targets, not as people. People, Garrett said. They're not people. They're animals. Intelligent animals, maybe, but still animals. Neptune made a sound, sharp and angry. He drew more symbols, faster now, more aggressive. He drew humans hunting his kind, drew the bodies, drew the grief. He was showing them the genocide, the systematic elimination of his people. Then he did something that made my breath catch. He drew a small figure, clearly meant to be a child. He drew it playing, drew it learning, drew it growing. Then he drew human figures approaching, drew violence, drew the small figure disappearing. He was telling them about his own childhood, about watching his family be killed, about surviving by hiding, by learning to fear humans above all other dangers. Kyle had tears in his eyes. Oh my God, he's telling us his story. He's showing us what we did to his people. Neptune drew one more thing. He drew the symbol for few, then the symbol for ending. His people were almost gone, and he was asking, through the only means he had, if humans would let them survive, or if we would finish what we'd started generations ago. The clearing fell silent, except for the sound of wind in the trees and distant waves on the shore. The three hunters stood staring at Neptune, at his drawings, at the undeniable evidence of intelligence, of culture, of personhood. Finally, Garrett spoke, his voice rough. "What do you want us to do?" "Leave," I said simply. "Go back to wherever you came from and tell people that you found nothing. No tracks, no evidence, no Bigfoot. Let them live in peace." "We can't do that," Kyle said. "This is too important. The scientific community needs to know. These creatures need protection, legal status, habitat preservation." "And how do you think that happens?" I asked. "You publish your findings, and what comes next? Scientists wanting to study them, tourists wanting to see them, hunters wanting trophies, government agencies wanting to control them. Their lives become a circus, and they lose the last bit of freedom they have. Or," Pete said slowly, "we document this properly. We work with conservationists, with indigenous groups who've known about them for generations. We create protected habitat. We establish legal frameworks that recognize them as an endangered intelligent species. We do it right." Neptune had been watching this exchange, and though he couldn't understand our words, he seemed to grasp the conflict. He made a sound, questioning, and I turned to him. "They want to help," I said, using our shared language of gestures and simple vocalizations. "But helping means revealing your existence to the world. It means other humans will know about you, will want to study you, will change everything about how you live." Neptune looked at me for a long moment, then at the three hunters. Then he made a decision that would change everything. He walked forward, closing the distance between himself and the humans. Garrett's hand twitched toward his rifle, but Kyle grabbed his arm, stopping him. Neptune stopped about 10 feet away from them. Then slowly, deliberately, he placed his hand over his chest in the gesture that meant, "I am here, I am real, I acknowledge you." And then he extended that massive hand toward them, palm up, an offering, an invitation, a gesture of trust that transcended species, that said, "I choose to believe you might be different." Kyle was the first to respond. He stepped forward, slowly, carefully, and placed his hand in Neptune's palm. Human and Nekahani, touching for the first time in generations without violence, without fear, with something that might possibly be the beginning of understanding. "I promise," Kyle said, his voice shaking, "I promise we'll do everything we can to protect you and your people. You have my word." Neptune made a soft sound, the one I'd learned meant gratitude or hope. Then he released Kyle's hand and stepped back. He looked at me, and I saw in his eyes both relief and terror. He'd taken the gamble. He'd revealed himself, trusted humans with his existence, with his family's safety, and now we'd see if humanity had evolved enough to respond with wisdom instead of violence. Garrett cleared his throat. "We need to talk, all of us, about what happens next, about how we protect them, about how we do this right." "Not here," I said, "and not without his family. If we're going to make decisions about their future, they all need to be part of the conversation." Neptune made an affirmative sound. Then he turned and walked toward the northern end of the island, gesturing for us to follow. We were going to meet Marina and Carly. We were going to bring them into this fragile, terrifying moment of first contact. And whatever happened next would determine not just their fate, but the fate of every remaining Nekane hiding in the forests and coastlines of the Pacific Northwest. The walk to the northern caves felt like a journey between worlds. Neptune led the way, moving with that fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. I walked beside him, while the 3 hunters followed at a respectful distance, their rifles now slung over their shoulders, no longer held at ready. The forest was quiet, as if holding its breath. Even the birds seemed to sense that something momentous was happening, that the boundary between hidden and known was about to be crossed in a way that couldn't be undone. When we reached the tide pools, Marina was waiting. She stood at the edge of the water, Kali held protectively in her arms, her body language radiating fear and defiance in equal measure. When she saw the humans following Neptune, she made a sound, sharp and warning. Neptune approached her quickly, making soft vocalizations, reassuring her. They had a brief, intense conversation in their own language, too rapid and complex for me to follow. I could see Marina's resistance, her fear, but also her trust in Neptune, her willingness to follow his lead even when every instinct screamed danger. Finally, she nodded. She set Kali down, keeping one hand on the child's shoulder, and faced the humans. Kyle made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "There's a child. They have a child. Her name is Kali," I said quietly. "She's almost a year old. She's learning to swim, learning to communicate with the orcas, learning the skills she'll need to survive in a world that's increasingly hostile to her existence." Kali peeked out from behind Marina's leg, her golden brown fur catching the morning light, her eyes wide with curiosity and fear. She made a small sound, questioning, and Marina responded with gentle reassurance. "Can I?" Kyle asked, gesturing toward his camera. "Can I photograph them? For documentation, for evidence? I promise the photos will be used only to help protect them." I looked at Neptune, asking permission through our shared gestures. Neptune looked at Marina, and they had another brief conversation. Finally, Marina nodded, though her body remained tense, ready to grab Kali and run at the first sign of threat. Kyle slowly pulled out his camera, a Nikon with a telephoto lens, and began taking photographs. He worked carefully, respectfully, narrating what he was doing so they could understand his intentions. "This is incredible," Pete said, watching Marina and Kali. The way she's protecting her child, the way they communicate, it's so human, so familiar. Because intelligence and love aren't uniquely human, I said. We've just convinced ourselves they are so we can justify treating other species as resources instead of as people. Garrett had been quiet, watching the family with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, he spoke. I've been hunting Bigfoot for 23 years. Since I was a kid, hearing stories from my grandfather about creatures in the woods. I've spent thousands of hours in the forest, thousands of dollars on equipment, been laughed at by everyone who knew what I was doing, and I always told myself that when I finally found one, when I finally had proof, it would be the greatest moment of my life. He paused, looking at Neptune, at Marina, at little Kali, but standing here, seeing them, seeing their fear, their family, their intelligence, all I feel is shame. Shame that my species has done this to them, that we've hunted them, killed them, driven them to the edge of extinction, that they have to hide from us, have to fear us, because we've proven over and over that we can't be trusted. Neptune had been watching Garrett closely, and though he couldn't understand the words, he seemed to grasp the emotion behind them. He made a sound, soft and complex, and drew a symbol in the sand. It was one I'd seen before, the one that meant understanding or recognition or seeing truly. He's saying he sees you, I translated. He recognizes your regret, your understanding. He's acknowledging that you're different from the humans who hunted his people. Garrett's eyes filled with tears. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him that if I can do anything, anything at all, to help protect his family, to help his people survive, I will. That's my promise. I translated as best I could, using gestures and simple vocalizations. Neptune listened, then made a decision. He walked over to Garrett, towering over the human, and placed one massive hand on Garrett's shoulder. It was the same gesture he'd used with me, the gesture that meant, I see you, I acknowledge you, I choose to trust you. Garrett broke down completely, sobbing like a child. Kyle and Pete moved to support him, and I saw that they were crying too. We were all crying, overwhelmed by the weight of this moment, by the recognition of what had been lost and what might possibly be saved. Marina made a sound, and Neptune turned to her. She was pointing at the ocean, where a pod of orcas had appeared, their black fins cutting through the water. J-pod, I recognized, the family I'd been studying for over a year. Neptune made a vocalization, complex and beautiful, and the orcas responded. They moved closer to shore, and I could see them clearly now. The matriarch J2, her children and grandchildren, a family group of 12 whales. Then Neptune did something that made everyone fall silent. He waded into the water, gesturing for us to follow. Marina picked up Kali and followed him, and after a moment's hesitation, so did the rest of us. We stood in the shallow water, humans and Nekani together, as the orcas approached. They came close, closer than I'd ever seen them come to shore, close enough that we could see the details of their markings, the intelligence in their eyes. Neptune made another vocalization, and J2 responded. They were talking, communicating across species in a language that predated human observation, in a relationship that had existed for generations. Then J2 did something extraordinary. She rolled on her side, exposing her white belly, and made a specific vocalization. It was the sound orcas made when greeting family members, when acknowledging pod relationships. She was welcoming us, all of us, humans and Nekani. together. She was saying that we were all part of the same community, the same web of intelligence and consciousness that connected all thinking beings. Kyle was filming now, capturing everything. "This is going to change the world," he whispered. "This is going to change everything we think we know about intelligence, about communication, about the boundaries between species. Only if we do it right," I said. "Only if we protect them first, before we reveal them. Only if we make sure that when the world learns about the Nekani, it's in a context of respect and protection, not exploitation and curiosity." "Agreed," Garrett said, having composed himself. "We document everything, but we don't publish anything until we have legal protections in place. We work with conservationists, with indigenous groups, with anyone who can help create a framework that recognizes them as an endangered intelligent species with rights. And we keep the location secret," Pete added. "No one can know where they are. This island becomes a sanctuary, protected, off limits to everyone except approved researchers." Neptune had been listening to this conversation, and though he couldn't understand our words, he seemed to grasp that we were making plans, making promises. He looked at me, questioning. "They want to help," I said, using our shared language. "They want to protect you, to make sure your people can survive. But it means change. It means other humans will know you exist. It means your life will never be the same." Neptune looked at Marina, at Kali, at the orcas still swimming nearby. Then he drew in the wet sand, creating a complex message. He drew the symbol for hiding, then crossed it out. He drew the symbol for fear, then crossed that out too. Then he drew a new symbol, one I'd never seen before. It combined elements of several other symbols, creating something that meant something like living openly or existing without shame or being seen and recognized. He was saying that hiding was a kind of death, that living in constant fear was no life at all, that if there was even a chance that humans could see his people as people, could recognize their right to exist, it was worth the risk of being known. Marina made a sound, sad but accepting. She understood what Neptune was saying, and though it terrified her, she agreed. For Kali's sake, for the sake of whatever other Nekani remained hidden in the forests, they had to take this chance. "Okay," I said to the hunters, "we do this, but we do it carefully, methodically. With their input at every stage, they're not subjects to be studied. They're partners in this process. Understood?" All three men nodded. "Understood," Garrett said. "We work with them, not on them. We protect them first, document second." Neptune made the approval sound, then gestured for everyone to come closer. We formed a circle in the shallow water, humans and Nekane and orcas nearby, all of us connected in this moment of first contact, of recognition, of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, humanity had evolved enough to respond to intelligence with respect instead of violence. As the sun rose higher, painting the water in shades of gold and blue, I felt something shift in the world. A boundary had been crossed, a secret revealed, a relationship begun that would change everything. I didn't know then that it would take another 50 years to fully understand what Neptune had been trying to teach me. I didn't know that the revelation of his people's existence would be both a triumph and a tragedy, that protection would come with costs, that being known would bring both salvation and loss. All I knew in that moment was that I'd been given a gift, the privilege of witnessing something that no human had witnessed before. The moment when two intelligent species chose connection over separation, chose trust over fear, chose the possibility of understanding over the certainty of isolation. And standing there in the water, with Neptune's hand on my shoulder and the orcas calling nearby, I understood what he'd been trying to tell me all along. We're all connected, all of us. Humans and Nekani and orcas and every thinking being that shares this world. And the only way any of us survive is if we recognize that connection, honor it, protect it, and build our future on the foundation of mutual respect and understanding. It was a simple truth, but it was one that would take me 50 years to fully comprehend, and one that humanity is still struggling to accept. The years following that morning in the water passed in a blur of activity, negotiation, and careful documentation. Garrett, Kyle, and Pete kept their word. They didn't publish their findings, didn't reveal the location of Sentinel Island, didn't exploit what they'd witnessed for fame or profit. Instead, they became allies, working behind the scenes to build a framework that might protect Neptune's people when their existence was finally revealed to the world. But the process was agonizingly slow. Legal protections for a species that officially didn't exist were nearly impossible to establish. We needed evidence, but releasing that evidence prematurely could trigger exactly the kind of attention we were trying to prevent. We needed allies in government, in conservation organizations, in indigenous communities, but every person we brought into the secret was another potential leak, another risk. By 1976, 2 years after that first contact, we'd made some progress. Kyle had connections with the Lummi Nation, whose traditional territories included much of the coastal Pacific Northwest. When we approached their elders with our evidence, with photographs and recordings and my detailed documentation, they weren't surprised. "We've always known they were there," one elder told us, a woman named Sarah James, who was in her 80s. "We called them Tsemekways, the wild people of the woods. Our ancestors traded with them, respected their territories, understood they were people like us, just different. When the white settlers came, when the hunting started, the Tsemekways went into hiding. We've been protecting their secret for generations." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Garrett asked. "Why keep it hidden when recognition could have brought protection?" Sarah looked at him with eyes that had seen too much history. "Protection from who? From the government that put our children in boarding schools? From the settlers who took our land? From the hunters who killed everything they didn't understand? We kept the secret because revealing it would have meant their extinction. Just like revealing our sacred sites meant they were destroyed, revealing our fishing grounds meant they were depleted. Some things survive only by remaining hidden." She was right, of course, and her words haunted me as we continued our work. Were we doing the right thing by trying to bring the Nekane into the light, or were we just setting them up for a different kind of destruction? Neptune seemed to understand the complexity of what we were attempting. Our communication had become more sophisticated over the years. I'd learned more of his language, and he'd learned more of mine. We could have conversations now, real conversations about abstract concepts, about the future, about the risks and possibilities of revelation. One evening, in the summer of 1977, we sat on the beach watching Kali play in the tide pools. She was 3 years old now, confident and curious, fearless in a way that both delighted and terrified her parents. She'd grown up knowing me, knowing that at least some humans could be trusted, and that knowledge had shaped her in ways that were different from her parents' generation. "She doesn't know fear the way we do," Neptune said, using a combination of vocalizations and gestures that I'd learned to understand. "She's never had to hide from humans, never had to watch her family be hunted. Is that good or bad?" It was a profound question, one I'd been wrestling with myself. "I think it's good," I said slowly. "Fear is useful for survival, but it's also limiting. If Kali grows up without that fear, maybe she can build relationships with humans that your generation never could. Maybe she can be a bridge." Neptune made a sound that I'd learned meant something like hope mixed with doubt. "Or maybe we're making her vulnerable, teaching her to trust when trust has always meant death for our people." "The world is changing," I said, echoing the symbol he'd drawn so many times. "Your old strategy of hiding isn't working anymore. There's nowhere left to hide, so maybe the only option is to change the relationship, to make humans see you differently." "And if they can't?" Neptune asked. "If humans are incapable of seeing us as people, if violence and exploitation are fundamental to your species?" It was the question that kept me awake at night. Because looking at human history, at our track record with anything we perceived as other, I wasn't sure I could argue with his pessimism. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I know that some humans can change. I changed. Garrett and Kyle and Pete changed. Sarah and her people never needed to change because they always understood. So maybe there's hope. Maybe if we can reach enough people, if we can make them see what I see when I look at you and your family, maybe things can be different." Neptune looked at me for a long moment, then made a gesture that meant something like faith or trust in the unknown. "You've given us 3 years of safety," he said. 3 years where Kali could play without fear, where Marina could sleep without nightmares, where I could swim with the orcas without constantly watching for hunters. That's more than my people have had in generations. Whatever happens next, we're grateful for that." His words made my throat tight. 3 years. It seemed like so little, such a small island of peace in an ocean of violence and fear. But to Neptune's family, it was everything. By 1979, our coalition had grown. We had allies in the Lummi Nation, in the Snoqualmie tribe, in several other indigenous groups whose territories overlapped with reported Bigfoot sightings. We had sympathetic contacts in the National Park Service, in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in conservation organizations. We had documentation that would convince any serious scientist that the Neh-Ka-Ni were real, were intelligent, were deserving of protection. But we still didn't have legal framework that would protect them once their existence was revealed, and we were running out of time. The problem was development. The Pacific Northwest was growing rapidly. Forests being cleared for housing developments, coastlines being developed for tourism, wilderness areas shrinking year by year. The territories where Neh-Ka-Ni could survive were disappearing, and with them, the last remnants of their population. Neptune showed me this one day in the fall of 1979. He'd been gone for 2 weeks, longer than he'd ever been away before, and when he returned, he was different. Older somehow, worn down by something more than just physical exhaustion. He drew in the sand, showing me a map of the Pacific Northwest. Then he marked locations, places where he knew other Neh-Ka-Ni families were hiding. There were 7 marks, 7 families, scattered across Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia. Maybe 30 or 40 individuals total, the last remnants of a people who had once numbered in the thousands. Then he began crossing out the marks, one by one. This family, their territory had been clear-cut. The old-growth forest they depended on destroyed. This family, their water source, had been polluted by industrial runoff. This family, they'd been forced to move when a highway was built through their territory, and no one knew where they'd gone. By the time he finished, only 3 marks remained uncrossed. 3 families, including his own, still surviving in territories that hadn't yet been destroyed by human development. "We're dying," Neptune said, using the simple, direct language we developed for difficult truths. Not from hunting anymore, though that still happens. From habitat loss, from pollution, from the destruction of everything we need to survive. In another generation, maybe 2, we'll be gone, extinct, and the world will never know we existed. I looked at the map, at the crossed-out marks representing families lost, and felt a rage so intense it made my hands shake. This was genocide, not the quick, violent kind, but the slow, bureaucratic kind. Death by 1,000 cuts, by development permits and logging contracts and pollution regulations that were never enforced. "Then we have to act now," I said. "We can't wait for perfect legal protections. We have to reveal your existence and force the world to respond. It's risky, but doing nothing is certain extinction." Neptune looked at me with those dark, intelligent eyes. If we reveal ourselves, some humans will want to protect us, but others will want to capture us, study us, control us. Others will see us as threats to be eliminated. Others will see us as attractions, as curiosities to be displayed. Are you sure the protection will outweigh the exploitation? No, I admitted. I'm not sure of anything. But I know that hiding isn't working. I know that your people are dying in silence, unknown and unmourned. At least if the world knows you exist, there's a chance. A chance for protection, for habitat preservation, for recognition of your rights. It's not a guarantee, but it's more than you have now. Neptune was quiet for a long time, watching the waves, listening to the orcas calling in the distance. Finally, he made a sound, the one that meant decision, or the moment of choosing. "We'll do it," he said, "but not just my family, all of us. The 3 families that remain will reveal ourselves together. That way the world will understand we're not just one anomaly, one strange creature. We're a people, a species, a culture that deserves to survive." "How?" I asked. "How do we bring 3 families together without drawing attention? How do we coordinate a revelation that will be taken seriously?" Neptune drew more in the sand, showing me a plan that must have been forming in his mind for years. There was a place, he showed me, deep in the Olympic Mountains, where the 3 families sometimes gathered. A hidden valley with old-growth forest, clean water, abundant food. It was sacred to his people, the last place where they could be together without fear. "We'll gather there," Neptune said, "all of us, and we'll invite humans, the ones we trust. You, Garrett, Kyle, Pete, Sarah, and her people. We'll let you document us, photograph us, record our language, witness our culture, and then you'll take that evidence to the world and demand protection." "When?" I asked, my heart racing. "Next summer," Neptune said. "The summer of 1980. We'll need time to contact the other families, to prepare them, to make sure everyone understands the risks. But by next summer, we'll be ready." I looked at him, at this magnificent being who was gambling everything on the hope that humanity had evolved enough to respond with wisdom instead of violence. I'll make sure we're ready too, I promised. I'll make sure that when you reveal yourselves, the world is prepared to see you as people, not as monsters or curiosities. You have my word. Neptune made the gesture we developed years ago, hand over heart. I know, he said. That's why we're trusting you. The months leading up to the summer of 1980 were the most intense of my life. I was 35 years old, and I'd spent 7 years of my life preparing for this moment. 7 years of building relationships, gathering evidence, creating networks of allies who could help protect the Nekani when their existence was revealed. Garrett, Kyle, and Pete had been working on a documentary carefully edited to show the Nekane as intelligent, peaceful, deserving of protection. They had footage of Neptune communicating, of Marina caring for Kali, of the family interacting with orcas. They had my recordings of Nekane vocalizations, my analysis showing the linguistic complexity. They had testimony from Sarah and other indigenous elders confirming that their people had always known about the Tsemekwes. We had everything we needed, except the one thing that would make it undeniable. Multiple families gathered together, willing to be documented and witnessed. In June of 1980, Neptune came to me with news. The other families had agreed they would gather in the Hidden Valley in late July. They were ready to step out of the shadows, to take the risk of being known. "There's something else," Neptune said, and I heard hesitation in his voice. "Something I need to show you before we do this. Something that will help you understand why we're so afraid, why this decision is so difficult." He led me deep into the island's interior, to a place I'd never been before. There, hidden in a cave system that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look, was a repository. It was filled with artifacts, hundreds of them, baskets, tools, carved wooden implements, woven fabrics, but also something else. Bones, Nekani bones, carefully arranged, respectfully preserved. The remains of Neptune's people, collected over generations, kept safe from human discovery. "This is our cemetery," Neptune said quietly. "Every Nekani who has died on this island for the last 200 years is here. We couldn't bury them in the open, couldn't mark their graves, couldn't mourn them publicly. So we brought them here, to this sacred place, where they could rest without being disturbed." I looked at the bones, at the evidence of generations of people who had lived and died in hiding, and felt tears streaming down my face. "How many?" I asked. 43, Neptune said. 43 people who lived their entire lives in fear, who died without ever being recognized, without ever being known. That's what hiding has cost us. Not just our numbers, but our dignity, our ability to mourn openly, to celebrate our dead, to pass on our stories. He picked up a small skull, clearly a child's, and held it gently. "This was my sister," he said. "She died when she was 5 years old from an infection we couldn't treat because we couldn't risk going to human doctors. She's buried here, unknown, unmourned except by our family, and there are thousands more like her, scattered across the Pacific Northwest, buried in hidden places, their lives and deaths unrecorded." "That's why we're doing this," Neptune continued, setting the skull back in its place with infinite care. "Not just for the living, but for the dead, so that our people can finally be recognized, so that their lives and deaths can matter, so that future generations won't have to hide their grief and their joy, and their existence. I understood then, in a way I hadn't before, what was at stake. This wasn't just about protecting an endangered species. It was about recognizing the humanity, the personhood of a people who had been denied that recognition for generations. It was about justice, about dignity, about the right to exist openly and be acknowledged. "I'll make sure the world understands," I promised. "I'll make sure that when people learn about your people, they understand the cost of the hiding, the tragedy of the silence. I'll make sure your dead are honored and your living are protected." Neptune made a sound, soft and grateful. "That's all we ask, to be seen, to be recognized, to be allowed to exist." On July 23, 1980, a small group of humans made their way into the Olympic Mountains. Me, Garrett, Kyle, Pete, Sarah James, and 3 other Lummi elders, and 2 representatives from conservation organizations who had been carefully vetted and brought into the secret. 12 humans, carrying cameras and recording equipment, hiking toward a hidden valley where 3 Nekani families waited. The journey took 2 days, following trails that weren't on any map, through old-growth forest that had somehow survived the logging that had devastated so much of the Pacific Northwest. The trees here were ancient, massive Douglas firs and western red cedars that had been standing for 500 years or more. The forest floor was thick with ferns and moss, and the air was filled with the sound of water, dozens of small streams feeding into a central river. On the afternoon of the second day, we reached the valley. And there, waiting in a clearing beside the river, were the Nekane. There were 11 of them: Neptune, Marina, and Kali. I recognized immediately. The other 8 were strangers, 2 more family groups, each with adults and children. They stood together, a community, watching as we emerged from the forest. The moment felt sacred, weighted with history and possibility. This was first contact, not between one human and one Nekani, but between our species, a meeting that should have happened generations ago, that could have happened with respect and recognition, but instead was happening now, in secret, as a desperate gamble for survival. Sarah James stepped forward first. She was the eldest among us, and she carried the authority of her people, of generations who had known about the Tzemekwes and protected their secret. She spoke in Lummi, words I didn't understand, but the tone was clear. Greeting, respect, acknowledgement. One of the Nekahne, an older male from one of the other families, responded. His vocalization was different from Neptune's, a different dialect perhaps, but clearly language, clearly communication. Sarah turned to us, tears in her eyes. "He says they've been waiting for this day for a long time, waiting for humans to be ready to see them, to recognize them. He says they're afraid, but they're also hopeful. He says they're trusting us with their lives, with their children's lives, with the future of their people." The weight of that trust was almost unbearable. I looked at the Nekani families, at the children clinging to their parents, at the adults standing tall despite their fear, and I understood that we couldn't fail them. Whatever it took, whatever sacrifices were required, we had to make sure that this moment led to protection, not exploitation. Over the next 3 days, we documented everything. Kyle and Pete filmed hours of footage showing the Nekani families interacting, communicating, demonstrating their intelligence and their culture. They showed us their tools, their art, their methods of food preparation. They taught us words in their language, showed us their writing system, demonstrated their knowledge of the forest and the animals they shared it with. The children, including Kali, played together, and we filmed that too. The universal nature of play, of childhood joy, of learning through exploration. It was impossible to watch them and not see people, not recognize the fundamental similarity beneath the physical differences. On the second night, the Nekahne performed something that Sarah said was a mourning ceremony. They vocalized together, a complex harmony that raised the hair on my arms, and they spoke the names of their dead. 43 names from Neptune's island cemetery, dozens more from the other families, a litany of loss, of people who had lived and died in hiding, unknown and unrecognized. When they finished, Sarah spoke. In my culture, we believe that people aren't truly gone until they're forgotten, until no one speaks their names anymore. Tonight, we've witnessed the Tsemekwe's honoring their dead, ensuring they're remembered, and now we've heard those names too. We're witnesses to their existence, to their lives and deaths. That's a sacred responsibility. On the third day, the eldest Nekahne, the one who had first responded to Sarah, asked to speak to all of us. Through a combination of vocalizations, gestures, and Sarah's translation, he told us their history. His people had lived in the Pacific Northwest for thousands of years, long before humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge, long before the first indigenous peoples arrived. They had watched as humans spread across the continent, and at first there had been peace. The early peoples, the ancestors of the Lumi and Snoqualmie and other tribes, had recognized the Nekahne as people, had traded with them, had respected their territories. But when European settlers arrived, everything changed. The Nekahne were seen as monsters, as threats, as game to be hunted. Bounties were offered, hunting parties were organized, families were slaughtered, and the survivors learned to hide, to avoid all human contact, to live in the shadows. "We've been dying slowly for 200 years," the elder said through Sarah's translation, "not just from hunting, though that continues, but from losing our land, our food sources, our ability to live as we've always lived. We're down to 3 families, maybe 40 individuals total. In another generation, we'll be gone, extinct, and the world will never know we existed." He paused, looking at each of us in turn. "That's why we're here. That's why we're revealing ourselves. Because hiding is killing us just as surely as hunting did. We need humans to see us, to recognize us, to protect what little territory we have left. We need legal status, habitat preservation, the right to exist openly. We're asking you to help us survive." The clearing was silent, except for the sound of the river and the wind in the trees. The weight of what he was asking, the trust they were placing in us, was overwhelming. Garrett spoke first. "I promise you, I will spend the rest of my life working to protect your people. I will use every resource I have, every connection, every bit of influence, to make sure that when the world learns you exist, it's in a context of respect and protection. You have my word." One by one, each of us made similar promises. We would be advocates, witnesses, protectors. We would make sure that the revelation of the Nekahne's existence led to conservation, not exploitation. The elder listened to each, promise, then made a sound that Neptune had taught me meant hope or faith in the future. "We believe you," Sarah translated. "We have to believe you because we have no other choice. Our survival depends on humans being better than they've been in the past. We're trusting that you represent that better future." We left the valley on July 26, 1980, carrying with us documentation that would change the world. Hundreds of photographs, hours of video footage, audio recordings of ne-ka-ne vocalizations, detailed notes on their culture and language, evidence that was undeniable, that would force the scientific community in the world to recognize that Bigfoot was real, was intelligent, was deserving of protection. But we didn't release it immediately. We spent the next 6 months working behind the scenes, building legal frameworks, securing commitments from conservation organizations, working with indigenous groups to establish protected territories. We wanted to make sure that when the revelation came, there were already mechanisms in place to protect the ne-ka-ne. Finally, on January 15, 1981, we went public. Garrett, Kyle, and Pete released their documentary through National Geographic. I published a paper in Science presenting the evidence for an undiscovered hominid species in the Pacific Northwest. Sarah and the Lummi Nation held a press conference confirming that their people had always known about the Tsemekwes and calling for immediate protection. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The documentary was watched by millions. My paper was downloaded hundreds of thousands of times in the first week. News outlets around the world covered the story. Bigfoot real, scientists confirm, read the headlines. New intelligent species discovered in North America. Last remnants of ancient people fight for survival. The scientific community was divided. Some researchers immediately accepted the evidence, began calling for protection and further study. Others were skeptical, demanded more proof, suggested it was an elaborate hoax. But the evidence was too strong, too detailed, too consistent to dismiss easily. Within weeks, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced they were conducting an emergency assessment to determine if the ne-ka-ne should be listed as endangered. Environmental groups filed lawsuits to halt logging and development in areas where ne-ka-ne had been documented. Indigenous groups asserted their treaty rights to protect Tsemekwes territories. But there was also backlash. Hunters who saw the ne-ka-ne as the ultimate trophy. Developers who saw endangered species protections as threats to their profits. Skeptics who insisted it was all a hoax, who demanded that the ne-ka-ne be produced for examination. And there were those who wanted to capture them, to study them, to keep them in facilities where they could be observed and tested. Scientists who saw them as research subjects rather than people. Government agencies that wanted to control them, to manage them like any other wildlife population. Neptune had been right to be afraid. Revelation brought both protection and threat, both recognition and exploitation. The next few years were a constant battle. Legal fights over habitat protection, debates about whether the ne-ka-ne should be classified as an endangered species or as an indigenous people with human rights. Attempts by various groups to locate and capture ne-ka-ne for study. Media circuses whenever there was a reported sighting. Through it all, the three families remained hidden, protected by a coalition of indigenous groups, conservationists, and allies like me who knew their locations and guarded that information fiercely. We'd revealed their existence, but we'd kept their specific location secret, understanding that privacy was essential to their survival. I continued my work on Sentinel Island, now officially designated as a ne-ka-ne sanctuary, off-limits to everyone except approved researchers. Neptune and his family remained there, and I continued to learn from them, to document their language and culture, to serve as a bridge between their world and mine. Kali grew up during these tumultuous years. By 1985, she was 10 years old, fluent in both Nech-Ka Ni and a simplified form of English that we'd developed together. She was curious about the human world in a way her parents never could be, asking questions about our technology, our culture, our ways of living. "Why do humans destroy so much?" she asked me one day, using the hybrid language we'd created. "Why do you cut down the old trees, pollute the water, kill the animals? Don't you understand that you're destroying yourselves too?" It was the same question Neptune had asked me years ago, and I still didn't have a good answer. "I think we've forgotten that we're part of the web," I said. "We've convinced ourselves that we're separate from nature, that we can control it, exploit it, without consequences. We're only just beginning to understand how wrong we are." "Will you learn in time?" Carly asked. "Or will you destroy everything before you understand?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I'm trying. We're all trying. Some of us, anyway." Carly looked at me with eyes that held a wisdom beyond her years. "My father says you're different from most humans. He says you see us as people, not as animals or curiosities. He says that's why he trusted you, why he revealed himself to you." "Your father is a remarkable person," I said. "He took an enormous risk, trusting me. I've spent every day since trying to be worthy of that trust." "You are," Carly said simply. "You've protected us. You've fought for us. You've helped the world see us as people. That's all we ever wanted." By 1990, 10 years after the revelation, some progress had been made. The Neka-Ni were officially listed as critically endangered, with full protection under the Endangered Species Act. Large areas of old-growth forest in Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia had been designated as protected habitat. Hunting them was illegal, with severe penalties for violations. But the population hadn't recovered. The 3 families we'd documented in 1980 were still the only confirmed groups. Despite extensive searches, no other Nech-Ka-Ni had been found. Either they were incredibly good at hiding, or there simply weren't any others left. Neptune was aging. He was probably in his 50s now, and the years of stress, of constant vigilance, of fighting for his people's survival had taken their toll. He moved more slowly, tired more easily. But his mind was as sharp as ever, and he continued to teach me, to share his people's knowledge and wisdom. One evening in the fall of 1992, we sat on the beach watching the sunset, as we'd done hundreds of times over the past 19 years. The orcas were passing by, J-Pod, still going strong, still calling to Neptune in their shared language. "Do you regret it?" I asked. "Revealing yourself, trusting humans, taking the risk?" Neptune was quiet for a long time, watching the whales. "I regret that it was necessary," he finally said. "I regret that my people couldn't live openly, couldn't exist without fear, couldn't be recognized without having to prove our worth. I regret that we had to gamble everything on the hope that humans had evolved enough to see us as people." "But do you regret the choice itself?" "No," Neptune said, "because the alternative was extinction in silence. At least now the world knows we existed. At least now our dead are recognized, our culture is documented, our story is told. Even if we don't survive, even if Kali's generation is the last, at least we'll be remembered. That's worth something." "You'll survive," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "We'll make sure of it." Neptune made a sound that might have been laughter or sadness or both. You've done everything you could, Marcus. You've been a true friend to my people, but some things are beyond even your control. The world is changing too fast. The forests are disappearing too quickly. The oceans are dying. We're adapted to a world that's vanishing, and we can't adapt fast enough to survive in the world that's replacing it. Then we have to change the world back, I said stubbornly. We have to protect the forests, clean the oceans, preserve the ecosystems that support all of us, not just for your people, but for orcas, for salmon, for every species that's struggling to survive in a world dominated by humans. That's what I've been trying to teach you all along, Neptune said softly. That's what I've been showing you for 19 years. The problem isn't just that humans don't recognize us. It's that humans don't recognize their connection to anything. You've separated yourselves from the web of life, convinced yourselves that you can survive alone, that you don't need the forests or the oceans or the other species you share this world with. But you do need them, he continued. You need them just as much as we do. The difference is, we've always known it. We've lived in balance, taken only what we needed, given back what we could. Humans take everything and give back nothing, and you're destroying the systems that keep you alive. That's what terrifies me most. Not that my people will go extinct, we probably will, but that humans will follow us, that you'll destroy yourselves through your own ignorance and greed. His words hit me like a physical blow because I knew he was right. Everything I'd learned in my years studying marine ecosystems, everything I'd witnessed in the declining orca populations, the collapsing salmon runs, the dying forests, it all pointed to the same conclusion. Humans were destroying the systems that sustained us, and we were doing it so quickly, so thoroughly, that we might not realize what we'd lost until it was too late to save ourselves. What do we do? I asked, feeling helpless. How do we change? How do we make humans understand before it's too late? Neptune looked at me with those dark, wise eyes. You keep teaching, he said. You keep showing people what I've shown you. That intelligence exists in many forms, that we're all connected, that destroying other species means destroying ourselves. You keep fighting even when it seems hopeless, because the alternative is giving up, and giving up means extinction, not just for my people, but for yours too. The years continued to pass. The 1990s gave way to the 2000s, and the world continued to change in ways that made survival increasingly difficult for the Nehkahne. Climate change was altering the forests they depended on, shifting the ranges of the plants and animals they relied on for food. Development continued to encroach on protected habitats, roads, and houses, creeping ever closer to the sanctuaries we'd fought so hard to establish. In 2003, Marina died. She'd been sick for several months, some kind of respiratory infection that we couldn't treat effectively. We'd tried bringing in veterinarians, doctors who specialized in great apes, but nothing worked. She died on a cool October morning with Neptune and Kali beside her, and with me bearing witness to her passing. The grief was overwhelming. Neptune mourned in a way that was both alien and utterly familiar. Vocalizations of loss that echoed across the island, a physical manifestation of heartbreak that transcended species. Kali, now 23 years old and fully grown, held her father as he wept, and I stood nearby, helpless to do anything but witness their pain. We buried Marina in the island cemetery, adding her bones to the 43 others who rested there. Neptune carved symbols into a piece of driftwood, creating a marker that told her story, her name, her life, her importance. It was the first time a Nekane had been buried with a marker, with public acknowledgement of their existence and their loss. After Marina's death, Neptune changed. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He still met with me, still taught me, still communicated with the orcas, but something essential had gone out of him. He'd lost his mate, his partner of over 30 years, and the loss had broken something fundamental. "We're not meant to be alone," he told me one day. "My people, we mate for life. We build families. We live in communities. Marina and I were together since we were young. She was my world, my anchor, my reason for surviving. Without her, I'm just waiting to die." "You have Kali," I said. "You have your daughter, your legacy. You have to stay strong for her." "Kali doesn't need me anymore," Neptune said. "She's grown. She's strong. She's learned everything I can teach her. And she's alone, Marcus. She's the only Nekane of her generation. There's no one for her to mate with, no one to build a family with. She's the end of the line." The reality of what he was saying sank in slowly. Kali was 23 years old, the age when Nekane typically started their own families. But there were no other young Nekane. The other two families we documented in 1980 had produced no children. The population was aging, dying, with no new generation to replace them. "We're watching our species go extinct," Neptune said quietly. "Not from hunting, not from habitat loss, but from simple demographics. There aren't enough of us left to maintain a viable population, even if we had perfect habitat, perfect protection, perfect conditions. We're too few. We've crossed the threshold. We're the walking dead. We just don't know it yet." I wanted to argue, to offer hope, to suggest solutions. Captive breeding programs, genetic interventions, something, anything that might save them. But looking at Neptune, at the resignation in his eyes, I understood that he'd already considered and rejected every possibility. He knew his people were doomed, and he'd made peace with it. "I'm sorry," I said, the words utterly inadequate. "I'm so sorry we couldn't save you." "You did save us," Neptune said. "Not from extinction, that was probably inevitable. But you saved us from dying unknown, unmourned, unrecognized. You gave us dignity. You made the world see us as people. You documented our language, our culture, our history. When we're gone, we'll be remembered. That's more than most extinct species get." In 2007, the last of the other two Nekane families died. An elderly male, the last survivor of his group, passed away in his sleep in a protected sanctuary in British Columbia. That left only Neptune and Kali, the last two Nekane on Earth. The news made international headlines. Last Bigfoot family faces extinction. Humanity's failure. Intelligent species dies on our watch. The world mourned, but the mourning felt hollow, performative. We'd known for years that the Nekane were dying. We'd had decades to save them, and we'd failed. I was 62 years old, and I'd spent 34 years of my life working to protect Neptune's people. And in the end, it hadn't been enough. We'd given them recognition, legal protection, preserved habitat. But we couldn't give them what they really needed: a world that could sustain them, a population large enough to survive, a future. Neptune was in his 70s now, ancient for a Nekane. He moved slowly, spent most of his time resting, rarely went into the water anymore, but his mind was still sharp, and he still had things to teach me. "I want you to understand something," he said one day in the spring of 2008. "Something important that I've been trying to show you for 35 years. He drew in the sand, creating an elaborate diagram. He showed the web of life, the connections between species, the cycles of nutrients and energy that sustained everything. Then he showed humans, separate from the web, taking from it but not contributing, breaking connections, simplifying the complex system into something that couldn't sustain itself. This is what I've been trying to teach you," Neptune said. "The reason my people are dying isn't just because humans hunted us or destroyed our habitat. It's because humans have broken the web. You've eliminated so many species, disrupted so many connections, that the whole system is collapsing. We're just the first intelligent species to go extinct in this collapse. But we won't be the last." He drew more, showing orcas declining, salmon disappearing, forests dying, oceans acidifying. "All of this is connected," he said. "The same forces that killed my people are killing the orcas, the salmon, the forests. And eventually they'll kill humans too, because you can't survive alone. No species can. We're all part of the web, and when the web breaks, everything dies." "How do we fix it?" I asked, though I'd asked the same question dozens of times over the years. "You can't," Neptune said simply. "Not completely. Too much has been broken, too many species have been lost, too many connections have been severed, but you can slow it down. You can protect what's left. You can try to rebuild some of the connections. You can teach other humans what I've taught you, that we're all connected, that destroying other species means destroying yourselves." "Will they listen?" I asked. Neptune made a sound that might have been laughter. "Some will, some won't. Humans are like that, capable of great wisdom and great stupidity, often at the same time. But you have to try, Marcus, because if you don't, if humans don't change, then my people's extinction will just be the beginning, and everything we've worked for, everything we've tried to teach, will be lost." On a cold morning in January of 2009, I found Neptune on the beach. He was lying on his side facing the ocean, his breathing shallow and labored. Kali was beside him, holding his hand, making soft sounds of comfort and grief. I approached slowly, and Neptune's eyes tracked me. He made a sound, weak but clear, calling me closer. I knelt beside him, and he reached out with his free hand, placing it over my heart in the gesture we'd shared for 36 years. I placed my hand over his heart in return, feeling the slow, irregular beat. "Thank you," Neptune said, using the simplified English we'd developed. The words were slurred, difficult for his vocal anatomy to produce, but unmistakable. "Thank you for seeing us, for recognizing us, for being our friend." "Thank you for trusting me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you for teaching me, for showing me a different way of seeing the world, for giving me purpose." Neptune made a sound, soft and warm. Then he looked at Kali, made a series of vocalizations in their language, too rapid for me to follow. Kali responded, her voice breaking with grief. Neptune turned back to me. "Take care of her," he said. "She's alone now, the last of our people. Help her, teach her, be her family." "I promise," I said. "I'll take care of her. She'll never be alone." Neptune's eyes moved to the ocean, where the orcas were calling J-Pod, still there after all these years, still singing their songs. Neptune made one last vocalization, a call to the whales, a goodbye. The orcas responded. their calls echoing across the water. They were saying goodbye too, mourning the loss of their friend, their companion of decades. Neptune's breathing slowed, then stopped. His hand, still resting over my heart, grew heavy, and just like that, he was gone. Kali made a sound, a vocalization of grief so profound it seemed to shake the air itself. She held her father's body, rocking back and forth, mourning in a way that was both alien and utterly, heartbreakingly human. The orcas continued to call, their voices rising and falling in what I recognized as their mourning song. They were grieving too, mourning the loss of Neptune, acknowledging his passing in their own way. I sat there on the beach, holding Neptune's hand, bearing witness to the death of the second-to-last member of an intelligent species, a people who had lived on this continent for thousands of years, who had developed language and culture and art, who had formed relationships with other intelligent species, who had survived in balance with their environment for millennia, and we had destroyed them, not quickly, not intentionally, but thoroughly. Through our hunting, our development, our pollution, our relentless expansion into every corner of the world, we had eliminated them. And with Neptune's death, only one remained. We buried Neptune in the island cemetery next to Marina, adding his bones to the 44 others who rested there. Kali carved a marker, more elaborate than any of the others, telling her father's story in the written language of her people, a language that she was now the last person alive who could read. The world mourned Neptune's death. News outlets covered it extensively. Scientists published obituaries in academic journals. Conservation organizations held memorials. The United Nations passed a resolution recognizing the Nekani as an intelligent species and acknowledging humanity's failure to protect them. But all the mourning, all the recognition, all the regret, it was too late. Neptune was gone, and with him, any hope of the Nekani surviving as a species. Kali remained on Sentinel Island with me. She was 34 years old, the last of her kind, facing a future alone. We continued our routines, our communication, our observations of the orcas, but everything was colored by loss, by the knowledge that she was the end of the line. "What do I do now?" she asked me one day, using the hybrid language we'd developed. "I'm the last. When I die, my people are gone forever. How do I live with that?" "You live by honoring them," I said, "by keeping their language alive, their culture alive, their memory alive. You teach me everything you know, and I'll document it, preserve it, make sure that even after you're gone, your people are remembered." "Is that enough?" Kali asked. "Is being remembered enough when you're extinct?" I didn't have an answer for her, because no, it wasn't enough. Memory was cold comfort when weighed against existence. But it was all we had left to offer. The years passed slowly. I continued my work, now focused entirely on documenting everything Kali could teach me about her people's language, culture, and knowledge. We recorded hours of her speaking Nekani, explaining the nuances of grammar and vocabulary that I'd never fully grasped. She taught me their songs, their stories, their understanding of the natural world, and she continued to communicate with the orcas. That relationship, at least, remained strong. The whales recognized her, called to her, included her in their social interactions. She would swim with them for hours, and I would watch from the beach, documenting this impossible friendship between two intelligent species. In 2015, J2 died. The matriarch of J-Pod, the whale who had known Neptune for decades, who had welcomed humans and Ne into her family's social circle, passed away at the age of approximately 90. Her pod mourned her for days, carrying her body, calling to her, refusing to let her go. Ka-Li mourned too. She'd known J2 her entire life, had learned to swim with her guidance, had been accepted into the pod's social structure. Losing J2 was like losing another family member, another connection to her past. "Everyone I love dies," Ka-Li said, watching the orcas carry J2's body. "My mother, my father, J2, everyone. And soon I'll die too, and there will be no one left who remembers them, no one left who speaks. Their names." "I'll remember," I said. "I'll speak their names. I'll make sure their stories are told." "You're human," Ka-Li said, not unkindly. "You'll die too, and then what? Who will remember us then?" It was a question I'd been wrestling with for years. I was 70 years old, and I wouldn't live forever. When I died, who would continue the work? Who would keep the Nekane's memory alive? I'd been training graduate students, bringing them into the secret, teaching them everything I'd learned. But it wasn't the same. They hadn't known Neptune, hadn't spent decades building relationships with the Nekane. They were studying an extinct species, not living with friends. In 2018, I published my final major work, a comprehensive documentation of Nekane language, culture, and ecology. It was over 1,000 pages, the culmination of 45 years of research. It included everything I'd learned from Neptune and Ka-Li, every observation, every conversation, every insight into their way of understanding the world. The book was well received, won awards, was translated into multiple languages. But reading the reviews, seeing it discussed in academic journals, I felt a profound sadness. This was a memorial, not a celebration. I was documenting a people who were gone, preserving their memory, because preservation was all that was left. Ka-Li read the book, slowly, with my help, translating the English. When she finished, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "You saw us," she said simply. "You really saw us, not as animals, not as curiosities, but as people. My father was right to trust you." "I wish I could have done more," I said. "I wish I could have saved you." "You did what you could," Ka-Li said. "You gave us recognition, dignity, a voice. You made sure we'd be remembered. That's not nothing." But it felt like nothing, weighed against extinction. Now, in 2023, I'm 78 years old. Ka-Li is 48, middle-aged for a Nekane, but healthy and strong. We still live on Sentinel Island, still maintain our routines, still communicate with the orcas when they pass by. But we both know this is the end. Ka-Li is the last of her people, and when she dies, the Nekane will be extinct. An intelligent species, with language and culture and thousands of years of history, will be gone forever. And the orcas are dying too. J-Pod is down to 73 individuals, the lowest number in decades. The salmon they depend on are disappearing. The waters they swim in are polluted. The noise from ships disrupts their communication. They're following the Nekane into extinction, another intelligent species destroyed by human activity. Standing on the beach this morning, watching Ka-Li swim with the orcas, I understood what Neptune had been trying to teach me for 50 years. We're all connected. The Nekane, the orcas, the salmon, the forests, the humans. We're all part of the same web. And when we break the connections, when we destroy other species, we're destroying ourselves. The Neokahni are dying because we destroyed their habitat, polluted their waters, eliminated their food sources. The orcas are dying for the same reasons. And eventually, humans will die too, because we can't survive in a world we've simplified to the point of collapse. That's what Neptune wanted me to understand. That's what he spent 50 years teaching me. Not just that his people deserve protection, but that protecting them meant protecting the entire web of life. That their extinction was a warning, a sign that the systems that sustain all of us are breaking down. I've spent 50 years documenting the Nekane, learning their language, preserving their culture, but the real lesson wasn't about them. It was about us. About humanity's relationship with the natural world, about our failure to recognize our connection to other species, about our willingness to destroy the systems that keep us alive in pursuit of short-term gain. Neptune's people are gone, or will be soon, but their message remains. We're all connected. We all depend on the same web of life, and if we continue to break that web, to destroy species and ecosystems and the complex relationships that sustain everything, we'll follow the Nekahni into extinction. That's what I've learned in 50 years of feeding Bigfoot. That's what Neptune told me about our species. And it should terrify us all. Because we still have time to change. We still have time to protect what's left, to rebuild some of the connections we've broken, to learn to live in balance instead of exploitation. But that time is running out, and every species we lose, every ecosystem we destroy, brings us closer to our own extinction. The Nekahni are our warning, our canary in the coal mine, and we need to heed that warning before it's too late. I'm 78 years old, and I've kept this secret for 50 years. But I'm not keeping it anymore. The world needs to know what I learned from Neptune, what he tried to teach me about humanity's place in the natural world. We're not separate from nature. We're part of it. And when we destroy it, we destroy ourselves. That's the truth. That's what Bigfoot told me about our species. And I pray that we're wise enough to listen before it's too late. Kali is swimming with the orcas now, the last of her kind, swimming with the last of theirs. Two intelligent species, both dying, both victims of humanity's failure to recognize our connection to the web of life. I'm documenting it all, preserving it, making sure that when they're gone, they'll be remembered. But memory isn't enough. We need to do better. We need to be better. For Neptune, for Marina, for Kali, for the orcas, for every species we've destroyed and every species we're in the process of destroying, we need to change before it's too late, before we're all extinct.